The rain was still on her scrubs when they threw her out. One moment, Claire Hartwell was the only person in Redwood General's trauma bay keeping a dying man alive. The next, security was dragging her through the lobby while Chief Physician Dr. Malcolm Graves screamed that she was finished, that she was nothing, that she had never been anything. She hit the wet pavement outside at 11:47 p.m. 43 minutes later, 3 military helicopters dropped out of the storm clouds and surrounded the hospital. Armed operators in tactical gear poured through every entrance, and the question they were asking, the one that made every staff member in that building go pale, was 4 words long. Where's the ghost? If you're watching this for the first time, subscribe right now, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go. The shift had started the way most of Claire's shifts started, badly and getting worse. Hargrove Peak Medical Center sat at the edge of a mid-sized city called Dunmore, the kind of place that felt perpetually between things, between prosperity and decline, between its industrial past and a future that hadn't bothered showing up yet. The hospital was one of the city's few genuine anchors, which meant it absorbed everything the city produced, the broken bones, the overdoses, the uninsured, the unlucky. It was underfunded, understaffed, and chronically exhausted, and the people who worked there had mostly made a quiet peace with all of that. Claire had been there 6 years. She was 34, medium height, with the kind of face that people described as calm when they meant something less flattering. She kept her dark hair pulled back tight, not for aesthetics, but because she'd learned years ago that loose hair caught on things at the worst possible moments. She wore minimal makeup. She moved through the ER with her shoulders slightly forward and her eyes constantly scanning, a posture that read as hesitant if you didn't know what you were looking at. Most people didn't know what they were looking at. Dr. Wallace Pryor had decided sometime in Claire's first week that she was a problem. Not a malicious one that would have required him to take her seriously, but an inconvenient one. A nurse who asked too many questions, who documented things with uncomfortable thoroughness, who had a habit of being right in ways that made him look less careful than he was. He'd started calling her Sparrow in her second month. She'd never asked him to stop because asking him to stop would have required a conversation she wasn't interested in having, and because she'd been called worse things by men with more authority in more serious situations, and it had never changed what she did or how she did it. Tonight, Pryor was in a particular mood. She could tell from the way he moved, that specific looseness in his shoulders that meant he'd already decided tonight was going to be easy, which always meant it was going to be difficult for everyone else. He was tall, blonde going gray at the temples, the kind of handsome that had once been genuine and was now maintained through expensive effort. He had a prestigious medical degree from a school he mentioned constantly, and the interpersonal warmth of a parking structure. Hartwell. He said her name like it was a mild inconvenience. Beds 4, 7, and 9 need discharge paperwork. Get on it. I'm monitoring the patient in 3, Claire said. His pressure's been dropping for the last 20 minutes. I've seen the chart. He's stable. His last reading was 86/54. Hartwell. Pryor's voice took on that particular quality, the one that meant he was about to say something that would make the nearby staff members suddenly find somewhere else to look. I've been practicing medicine for 19 years. Do you understand that? 19 years. I don't need a floor nurse reading me numbers like I forgot how blood pressure works. The patient in bed 3 is stable, and I need discharge papers for 4, 7, and 9. Do your job. The nearby staff did, in fact, find somewhere else to look. Claire looked at him for one moment longer than was comfortable. Then she went to start the discharge paperwork, because this was not her first shift with Dr. Pryor, and she understood the game well enough to know when a battle wasn't worth the cost of fighting it. She also flagged the patient in bed 3 for a recheck in 15 minutes. Pryor didn't notice. Or he noticed and didn't care. With him, it was sometimes hard to tell. The first 2 hours of the shift were routine in the grinding, unglamorous way ER shifts were routine. A broken wrist from a construction site, a teenager with a panic attack, an older man with chest pain that turned out to be severe reflux. A woman who'd been waiting 4 hours with a cut on her forearm that needed 7 stitches and kept apologizing for taking up space. Claire moved through all of it with the same steady efficiency she brought to every shift, the kind that came from doing a thing 10,000 times until the mechanical part of your brain handled it and your mind was free to notice the things that mattered, like the way the patient in bed three's color was shifting. His name, according to the intake form, was James Wolfe. 41 years old, brought in by ambulance after a single vehicle collision on Route 9, his truck had gone off the road into a ditch, no other cars involved, no obvious impairment, no obvious cause. The paramedics had noted a laceration on his forehead, possible fractured ribs, and a mild concussion. Pryor had confirmed the assessment and ordered standard monitoring. Claire had been watching him since he came in. There was something wrong with the picture. She couldn't have articulated it in a way that would have satisfied Pryor's demand for quantifiable data, but she'd spent enough time in trauma situations to know that her instincts were usually pointing at something real, even when she couldn't immediately name it. His skin had a faint grayish tint that wasn't consistent with the blood loss from his laceration. His pupils, when she checked them on her own initiative, were slightly unequal, a detail that had been noted on intake and attributed to the concussion, but something about the pattern didn't read as head trauma to her, and his hands were trembling. Fine, continuous tremors, both hands. She'd seen that before in trauma patients, but she'd seen it more prominently somewhere else, in a context she'd spent 6 years trying not to think about. She pulled up his labs on the terminal and read through them twice. On the surface, they were consistent with the diagnosis, but there was a detail in the metabolic panel, a specific enzyme pattern, that made the back of her neck go cold. "I need to ask Dr. Pryor about bed 3, she told Marcus Webb, one of the other nurses, as she passed the station. Marcus was 26, good at his job, and had already developed the survival instinct of keeping his head down around Pryor. "Good luck," Marcus said, and he wasn't being sarcastic. She found Pryor at the physician workstation, eating a granola bar and scrolling through something on his phone that was clearly not patient-related. "The metabolic panel on Wolfe in bed 3, she said. "The acetylcholinesterase level is flagged as low. Yes, I saw it." Pryor didn't look up from his phone. "Consistent with the stress response from the accident. It'll normalize." "The pattern is consistent with organophosphate exposure." That made him look up. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression he reserved for moments when she genuinely annoyed him, not the reflexive dismissal he used when she questioned his assessments, but something with more weight to it, like she'd said something that had bothered him on a level he needed to address. "That," he said, "is an extraordinary claim." The tremors, the meiosis pattern, the enzyme suppression. He was in a car accident, Hartwell, on a rural highway in Dunmore. His voice had taken on a deliberate patience that was its own form of condescension. "Do you know what the differential for those symptoms is in a standard trauma presentation? Because I do. I went to medical school for this. I know the differential. I'm saying this particular combination reads differently to me. It reads differently to you." He set his phone down and turned to face her fully, which was never a good sign. "Let me explain something to you, again, because apparently we need to have this conversation regularly. You are a floor nurse. Your job is to execute physician orders accurately and to monitor patients for changes that require physician attention. Your job is not to form independent diagnoses. Your job is not to second-guess attending physicians based on your—" He made a gesture that somehow communicated everything he thought about her. "Instincts. Do I make myself clear? If he's been exposed to a nerve agent, he has not been exposed to a nerve agent." The deliberate patience was gone now. "He was in a car accident. This is Dunmore. We are not a military base or a chemical plant or whatever scenario you've apparently constructed in your head. He has a concussion and fractured ribs and a low enzyme reading that will correct itself, and you are going to go do your actual job before I start documenting what a disruption you've been on this shift." Claire stood there for 2 more seconds. Then she said, "I'm going to recheck his vitals." "Hartwell." She was already moving. The patient in bed 3 had declined since her last check. His pressure was down to 78/48. His tremors were more pronounced. His lips had a faint bluish tinge that she'd clocked the second she pushed back the curtain, and he was conscious but clearly struggling. His eyes had a glazed, unfocused quality, and when she asked him how he was feeling, his response was slurred in a way that had nothing to do with the concussion. She did the recheck. She looked at the numbers. Then she opened the medication cabinet beside the bed and took out atropine. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew what it was going to cost her. She prepared the injection with hands that were steady, Not because she wasn't afraid, but because fear had a different relationship to her hands than it did for most people. She'd been afraid before in situations where her hands shaking would have meant something dead that should have been alive. She'd learned a long time ago to let the fear happen somewhere separate from the function. "Sir," she said quietly, "my name is Claire. I'm going to give you something that's going to help. I need you to stay still." He looked at her. For a moment, through whatever was happening inside his body, something clear came into his eyes. "They found me," he said. His voice was barely audible. "They always find me." She gave him the atropine. She was reaching for the second component of the protocol, the pralidoxime, which was what the atropine was buying time for. When the curtain ripped open and Dr. Pryor was standing there with his face arranged in an expression she'd never quite seen on him before. Not just anger. Something that had anger as its surface layer, but underneath it was something more urgent and harder to name. He looked at the syringe in her hand. Then he looked at the patient. Then he looked at her, and his voice, when he finally spoke, was very quiet and very controlled in a way that somehow felt worse than shouting. "Put that down." "He's in cholinergic crisis," Claire said. "His acetylcholinesterase is suppressed. If we don't—" I said put it down. "Dr. Pryor, security." She kept her eyes on the patient and completed the second injection with 12 seconds of unbroken focus while Pryor shouted behind her and the sound of approaching footsteps came from the hallway. She capped the needle, noted the time in her mental log, checked the patient's airway and his pulse, already responding, already slightly stronger, and turned around. 2 security guards were standing behind Pryor, and Pryor had his arms crossed with the specific rigidity of a man who had already decided what was going to happen next. "You administered medication without a physician's order," he said, in direct defiance of my explicit instruction, in front of witnesses. "He would have died. That is not your call to make." Something had cracked loose in Pryor's composure now. His voice had risen, and the people in nearby bays had gone very quiet. "That has never been your call to make. You are a nurse. You follow orders. You don't—" He stopped, recalibrated, lowered his voice with visible effort. "You don't practice medicine without a license in my ER. That is a line that doesn't get crossed. Not by anyone. Not even by you." He nodded at the security guards. "Escort her out of the building. She's terminated. Effective immediately." Claire looked at him. She looked at the patient, whose color was already marginally better, whose tremors had slightly reduced, who was looking at her with eyes that were a little clearer than they'd been 2 minutes ago. She put down the capped syringe. "His airway needs to be monitored closely for the next 30 minutes, she said. "If his pressure drops below 70, you need to—" "Now," Pryor said to the security guards. They took her by the arms. Not roughly, but firmly, with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this enough times that the awkwardness had worn off. She didn't resist. There was no version of resisting that made anything better. Marcus watched from the nurse's station as they walked her past. He had the expression of someone who wanted to say something and had correctly calculated the cost. She understood. She'd made the same calculation herself often enough. They walked her to her locker, waited while she retrieved her jacket and her bag, then walked her to the main entrance. The automatic doors opened onto the parking lot, and the sound of the rain hit her immediately. A full, heavy downpour that had apparently arrived while she was inside arguing about enzyme levels. One of the guards, a heavy-set man named Torres, whose name she knew from 6 years of nodding at each other in the hallways, said, "I'm sorry, Ms. Hartwell." She believed him. She stepped outside. The doors closed behind her. The rain was cold and immediate. She stood on the covered section of the entrance for a moment, looking at the parking lot, calculating the distance to her car, understanding that she was going to have to walk through the rain to get there. She'd parked at the far end of the lot because she'd arrived late, and the closer spots had been full. That felt like something from another life now, arriving late, worrying about parking spots. She started walking. The rain hit her when she cleared the overhang, and it was worse than she'd thought. The kind of rain that came in sideways because of the wind, that found its way through jackets. She pulled her collar up and moved across the wet asphalt with her head down, her mind already working through what came next because her mind defaulting to logistics under stress was something that happened automatically, that she'd never entirely been able to turn off. She had 6 years of documentation. She had the patient's deteriorating vitals time-stamped. She had her assessment in her mental record. She had the knowledge of what she'd seen and why she'd acted, and the certainty, separate from whatever happened next, that the man in bed 3 was alive because of what she'd done. It wasn't nothing. She was 3 rows from her car when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the storm, that was underneath it and then over it and then filling the entire sky. She stopped walking. She knew that sound. It was the specific acoustic signature of military rotary aircraft running without full navigation lights, a pattern of sound and suppression that civilian choppers didn't produce, that she hadn't heard in 6 years, but that her nervous system recognized before her conscious mind caught up. Her head came up. Her eyes went to the sky. 3 helicopters flying low and fast, breaking through the cloud cover to the south. Black, minimal markings. The body profile of modified Black Hawks. Not the civilian medevac variety, not the National Guard configuration she'd seen occasionally from the hospital roof during training exercises. These were operational platforms, and they were moving with the specific purposeful directness of aircraft that had a destination and a timeline. The destination appeared to be Hargrove Peak Medical Center. She stood in the rain and watched them descend. The first one went to the roof. The second and third set down in the parking lot. The far end, the empty section, the space that was exactly large enough if you knew what you were doing, and the rotors were still spinning when the doors opened and figures dropped out. She counted them without thinking about it. 12, 14, 16. More from the roof insertion, she'd estimate another 8 to 10 from that angle. Full tactical gear, weapons at ready low, moving in 2-column formation toward the building entrances. Not police. Not federal agents in the way she was used to seeing federal agents. These were operators, and they were moving through that parking lot like they'd rehearsed it. They probably had. She was still standing there, rain soaking through her jacket, watching them breach the main entrance, when a set of headlights swept across the lot. A military vehicle, not a Humvee, something newer, something she didn't have an immediate designation for, had pulled into the parking lot from the service road on the east side, and it stopped 20 feet from where she was standing. The passenger door opened. The man who got out was in his mid-50s, built like someone who'd been physically formidable once, and had maintained the structural architecture even as the edge softened slightly with age. He wore a uniform that was dry despite the rain, which meant he'd been inside the vehicle until about 8 seconds ago. His rank insignia, visible even in the parking lot's inadequate lighting, indicated he was a general officer. He walked toward her through the rain with the unhurried certainty of a man who had never, in his adult life, been unsure where he was supposed to be. He stopped 4 feet away and looked at her. "Claire Hartwell," he said. It wasn't a question. "That's me," she said. "I'm General Adrian Voss, and we have a situation." The rain came down between them. Behind him, through the glass front of the hospital she'd been thrown out of 43 minutes ago, she could see lights moving, hear the muffled sound of shouting, see staff pressed against the windows watching the tactical teams move through the building. "The patient you treated tonight," Voss said. "Bed 3. Tell me what you gave him and when." Claire looked at him for a long moment. "Atropine and pralidoxime. Atropine first, standard loading dose, 11:58 p.m. Pralidoxime immediately after. He was in cholinergic crisis, probable organophosphate exposure, symptoms consistent with a nerve agent," Voss said. "Specifically VX7, which is a variant that hasn't been seen outside classified weapons programs in 11 years. She was quiet. "The man in bed 3, Voss continued, is Colonel Donovan Marsh. He's a defense intelligence officer who went missing 4 days ago after his convoy was ambushed on a classified route 60 miles northwest of here. He's been missing for 96 hours, and whatever you gave him tonight is the only reason he's still breathing." He paused. "We've been looking for him. We've also been looking for you." The rain made a sound on the pavement around her. "I'm a nurse," she said. "You're a lot of things, Sergeant Hartwell," Voss said, using a title she hadn't heard attached to her name in 6 years, and something in her chest went completely still. "Some of them are in your personnel file. Most of them aren't." He glanced toward the hospital building. "But right now we have a colonel in your ER, a missing intelligence package, and Dr. Wallace Pryor, who has been placed in a holding room by my people because his bank records suggest he received $140,000 from a defense contractor called Armistice Solutions in the last 8 months. He brought his eyes back to her. We have a lot to talk about. Claire stood in the rain and felt the life she had built, carefully and with considerable effort, doing something she'd been quietly afraid of for 6 years, coming apart at the seams. What kind of contractor? She asked. The kind that doesn't make products, Voss said. The kind that makes problems disappear. The kind that 4 days ago made Colonel Marsh disappear. He held her gaze. The kind that knows he's alive now, and that knows someone just treated him who knows exactly what VX7 looks like. He paused. They're going to want to know who that is, Claire, and they're going to find out quickly. The lights in the hospital moved. One of the helicopters on the roof was repositioning. From somewhere on the upper floors, she could hear, faint through the rain and the distance, the sound of Dr. Pryor's voice rising toward something she'd never heard in it before. Not arrogance. Fear. 43 minutes ago, you threw me out of that building, she said. I know. I need to know he's going to be properly treated. My medical team is with him now. He's stable. Because of what you did. Voss took one step closer. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Go ahead. Your service record, the redacted portions, indicate you were involved in a classified casualty extraction in a theater of operations that's still sealed. I've seen enough of your file to know what you did there, and enough to know why you left. What I need to know is whether you still have it. The rain fell. Somewhere across the parking lot, more vehicle lights appeared as additional military assets arrived. Claire thought about the patient in bed 3, the clarity that had come into his eyes for 2 seconds before she gave him the atropine. They found me. They always find me. She thought about 6 years of keeping her head down, answering to Sparrow, documenting everything carefully, being right about things that didn't matter, letting the things that did matter go because the cost of fighting them was too high. She thought about what her hands had done tonight and how they'd done it, and that the steadiness hadn't been something she'd worked to maintain. It had just been there, like it had never left. Yes, she said. Voss nodded once, with the weight of someone who had been hoping for that answer and was now obligated to use it. Then we have a problem, he said, because Armistice Solutions knows the colonel is alive, and in approximately, he checked his watch, 6 hours, they're going to act on that information. We have a 48-hour window to find the rest of the operation before they disappear. He looked at her. And we just found out that the person they're most afraid of isn't in the custody file we were working from. He reached into his jacket and held something out to her. It was a laminated card with a photograph, her photograph, from a long time ago, in a different context, and a designation printed beneath it that she hadn't seen in 6 years. A call sign, Ghost. The rain hit the card and ran off it. They're looking for her, Voss said. They don't know she's been standing 40 feet from the colonel all night. He held her gaze. I need to know if she's still here. Claire looked at the card in his hand. She looked at the hospital behind him, where light moved through the windows, and somewhere on the upper floors, a doctor who had called her worthless for 6 years was answering questions from military intelligence in a holding room. She took the card. It was lighter than she expected. She didn't know why she'd expected it to have weight. Tell me about Armistice Solutions, she said, and the general began to talk. Armistice Solutions had started, Voss told her, as a legitimate defense consulting firm, the kind that existed in the gray space between government contracts and private capability, doing the work that bureaucracies couldn't do quickly enough and that official channels couldn't do quietly enough. For a decade it had operated in that space without drawing particular attention, which was, he said, exactly how it had been designed. The legitimacy had been the cover. Underneath it, Armistice had been building something else entirely. They stood beside the military vehicle while the rain came down and Voss laid it out in the clipped, economical language of someone who had briefed classified material often enough that the delivery was automatic. Claire listened without interrupting, which she could tell he appreciated, the way you could tell someone appreciated a thing when they didn't have to slow down or repeat themselves. Armistice had been running what intelligence analysts called a gray market weapons development pipeline, not manufacturing weapons directly, but funding the research, acquiring the components, and connecting the buyers to the science. The VX-7 that had nearly killed Colonel Marsh was a product of that pipeline. A variant that didn't exist in any public chemical weapons catalog, that bore no traceable signature to any sanctioned program, and that had been deployed twice in the last 3 years in ways that were designed to look like accidents. Marsh had found the thread. He'd been working the financial side of it, following the money through shell corporations and subsidiary accounts across 4 countries, when his convoy was hit. His intelligence package, a physical drive containing 18 months of compiled evidence, had been taken. Marsh had been taken with it, presumably because someone in the Armistice chain of command had decided a missing intelligence officer generated less scrutiny than a dead one. They'd miscalculated. Missing intelligence officers generated a great deal of scrutiny. The drive, Claire said. You don't have it. We don't have it. Marsh was conscious for approximately 20 minutes after he arrived at your ER, according to the paramedic report. If he hid it or disposed of it before losing consciousness, we don't know where it is. Voss glanced toward the hospital. He's not currently in a condition to tell us. He said something when I treated him, before he went under. Voss looked at her. He said they found him, that they always find him. She paused. He was lucid for about 4 seconds. That's what he chose to say. Meaning he knows Armistice has people inside the response chain. Voss's jaw tightened slightly. Which we've suspected. We have a leak somewhere between the field teams and the coordination level, and we haven't been able to locate it. Marsh may have been trying to warn us. Or he was just scared, Claire said. 4 seconds of lucidity after 96 hours of captivity and a nerve agent exposure. He might have just been scared. Voss looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. You're probably right, he said, in the tone of someone who knew she was right but found it inconvenient. Both things can be true. The rain hadn't let up. Across the parking lot, the activity around the hospital had settled into the organized, controlled rhythm of a secured site. Personnel at fixed positions, vehicle staging, the kind of order that came after the initial breach was done. Inside, through the glass, she could see the blur of movement that was Voss's people working through the ER. What do you know about Dr. Pryor? She asked. Right now, less than I'd like. Voss reached into the vehicle and retrieved a tablet, handed it to her. We flagged him 4 weeks ago when his name appeared in an Armistice financial audit we obtained from a partner agency. The payments started 11 months ago. Small amounts initially, then larger. The timeline correlates with when Armistice started moving assets into this region. She looked at the tablet. The financial summary was dense but readable. She'd looked at enough medical billing records to understand how to parse numbers that were trying to obscure what they were. The payments to Pryor were routed through a medical consulting firm she'd never heard of, which was almost certainly not a coincidence. He knew the colonel was coming, she said. We believe so, yes. That's why he wanted to transfer him out. When I pushed back on the assessment, he wasn't just being... She stopped, recalibrated. He wasn't just being himself. He was trying to move the patient before anyone else looked closely. And you made that impossible, Voss said. I also gave Pryor a reason to throw me out before I could document anything further. Which may have saved your life, Voss said, with a flatness that made it clear he wasn't being dramatic. If you'd still been in the building when the Armistice extraction team arrived... There was an extraction team? Was. Past tense. He took the tablet back. 12 minutes after Pryor terminated you, a 4-person team entered the hospital through the ambulance bay with falsified medical credentials. They were there to remove Marsh. My people intercepted them in the stairwell. A pause. 2 are in custody, 2 are not. We're working on that. Claire absorbed this. 12 minutes. She'd been standing in the rain for 12 minutes, walking to her car, standing there watching the helicopters come in, while 4 people with falsified credentials walked into the hospital to take the man she'd just saved. If your team had been 6 minutes later, she said. Yes, Voss said. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. She handed the card back to him, and then immediately felt the strangeness of that gesture, the reflex of returning something she hadn't decided to keep. He took it without comment. What do you need from me? She asked. Right now? Everything you remember about Marsh's presentation, every detail of the symptom pattern, the timeline, anything he said or did that seemed unusual beyond the obvious. He paused. And I need you to come inside. My medical team is good, but they don't have your specific familiarity with this exposure profile, and Marsh isn't stable enough for transport yet. I need someone who's seen VX7 presentation before to be in that room with him. I've never formally seen VX7, she said. Officially. Something in Voss's expression didn't quite shift, but something in it registered. Right, he said. Of course not. She looked at the hospital entrance. Walking back through those doors tonight was going to be... She searched for the right word and landed on something. Not simple. Not nothing. 6 years she'd walked through those doors, and 6 years she'd left through them, and tonight they'd thrown her out for the last time, and now she was being asked to go back in 45 minutes later because it turned out the thing they'd fired her for was the most important thing anyone had done in this hospital all year. There was something almost funny about it. Almost. Let's go, she said. The ER looked different under military occupation. Not dramatically different. The layout was the same, the equipment was the same, but there was a quality to the space that had changed, a seriousness that had displaced the particular, exhausted functionality of a night shift. Voss's people had secured the perimeter of Bed 3 with a temporary partition and a two-person security presence that would have looked absurd 6 hours ago and now looked completely necessary. The rest of the ER staff had been confined to the break room for initial interviews, which meant the floor was operating on skeleton coverage. One physician, two of Voss's embedded medical personnel, and now Claire. Marcus Webb was still at the nurse's station, outside the break room perimeter, because someone with direct patient knowledge had to be present, and he'd apparently volunteered. He looked at Claire when she came in with the expression of a man who had been through an experience that had significantly revised his assumptions about what a Tuesday night could become. "You're back," he said. "Apparently. Is he—" Marcus glanced toward the partition around Bed 3. "Is he going to make it?" "I don't know yet," she said. "That's what I'm here to find out." She pushed through to Marsh. He was worse than she'd left him in the specific particular way that nerve agent exposure worked. The initial stabilization from the atropine was holding at the surface level, but the underlying cellular damage was working on its own timeline, and she could see from the monitor readings that his respiratory function had declined slightly in the time she'd been outside. Voss's medical personnel, a young physician she didn't know named Dr. Reyes, who moved with the compact efficiency of someone with field training, had him on supplemental oxygen and had started a second line. "You're the one who treated him initially," Reyes said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes. Atropine and pralidoxime. Right doses, right sequence." "I know." He said it without edge. It was just a confirmation, not a challenge. "He was already in bronchospasm when we got to him. If you'd waited another 20 minutes... He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Claire moved to the bedside and looked at Marsh. In the flat light of the ER, unconscious and stripped of the fractional awareness she'd seen in those 4 seconds of lucidity, he looked small in the way that very sick people often looked small, diminished by the machinery sustaining them, by the vulnerability of a body working against itself. He was probably in his late 40s. There was gray at his temples and a scar on his jaw that looked old, from something that had happened a long time ago and healed imperfectly. "His current respiration rate," she said. Reyes gave her the numbers. She ran them against what she remembered from previous exposure profiles, not the ones in textbooks, the other ones, and made 2 adjustments to the pralidoxime protocol that Reyes didn't argue with. He had enough field experience to recognize when someone else had more specific knowledge about something, and he was secure enough not to make it a competition. She appreciated that. While she worked, Voss's intelligence team was moving through the rest of the hospital. She could hear them. The measured tread of people conducting a systematic search, the occasional clipped exchange in the hallway, the sound of filing cabinets being opened in the administrative wing. Somewhere above her, she knew, Dr. Pryor was in a room answering questions he'd never imagined he'd have to answer when he got up this morning. She wondered what his face looked like right now. She stopped wondering. It wasn't productive. An hour into her reassessment of Marsh's treatment, one of Voss's intelligence people, a compact, serious woman named Agent Tara Lund, who wore civilian clothes and had introduced herself with a handshake that was the professional equivalent of a closed door, appeared at the edge of the partition. "He's communicating," Lund said. Lund. Claire looked at Marsh. His eyes were open, barely, and not clearly focused, but open, tracking with the uncertain deliberateness of someone working very hard to maintain consciousness. She leaned forward. "Colonel Marsh, I'm Claire Hartwell. I'm the nurse who treated you when you came in. You're in a hospital. You're safe." His mouth moved. No sound. She leaned closer. "The 7. His voice was barely a thread. "The 7. "I need you to stay still," she said. "You can tell us when you're—" "Corvin." His hand moved on the bed, not reaching, just a small involuntary flexion. "Corvin has the—" He stopped. His eyes lost focus for a moment, then found it again with visible effort. 1719. "Do you—" Another stop. He was burning through what little coherence he had at a rate she didn't like. "Does Voss know about Corvin?" She straightened and looked at Lund. Lund's expression had done something that it hadn't done before. "Get the general," Claire said. Corvin, as it turned out, was a name. Voss took it with the controlled stillness of someone receiving information that confirmed something they'd feared, rather than something they hadn't considered. He stood at the edge of the partition while Lund spoke quietly to him, and his face did very little, and then he said, "Clear the room." And Reyes and the other medical staff moved back, leaving Claire, Voss, and Lund with the unconscious Marsh and the monitor sounds. "Nathan Corvin," Voss said. He wasn't asking for confirmation. He was saying it the way you said a thing that had just moved from the category of suspicion into the category of problem. "Director of Intelligence Coordination at the Eastern Defense Operations Group." "Which means what?" Claire said. "Which means he has access to every counter-operation asset we've deployed in the last 18 months, Lund said. She had a flat, precise delivery that suggested she'd been delivering bad news professionally for long enough that it no longer surprised her. "Including this one. He would have known we were moving on Hargrove Peak tonight. He would have known we were looking for Marsh. He would have known your timeline," Claire said. "Yes." "So the 2 from the extraction team who got away, Corvin could have pulled them out before we closed the perimeter," Voss said, "if he knew we were coming in." His jaw tightened fractionally, which he did. The monitor beeped steadily. Marsh had lost consciousness again, but his vitals were slightly more stable than they'd been 20 minutes ago, and his respiratory rate had moved in the right direction. Claire watched the numbers and thought about the word 1719 and what it might mean. A time. A room number. A code. A street address. And whether Marsh had managed to communicate something precise, or whether it was the fragmented output of a brain fighting through chemical damage. "What's 1719?" she asked. Voss looked at her. He said Corvin and then 1719, in that order. Voss and Lund exchanged something, not a look exactly, more the brief alignment of 2 people who'd just processed the same information toward the same conclusion. "There's a storage facility," Lund said carefully, "on the industrial east side of Dunmore, the Harwick complex. It was decommissioned by its previous owner about 14 months ago and acquired by a holding company we've been trying to trace for the last 6 weeks. She paused. "The address is 1719 Harwick Industrial Lane." The monitor beeped. Outside the partition, the hospital made its sounds. The ventilation system, the distant murmur of personnel conducting a search, the rain still hitting the windows with a persistence that seemed almost argumentative. "He's telling you where they took the drive," Claire said. "Or he's telling us where they're operating from," Voss said. "Or both. He was already moving toward the partition entrance. Lund, get a satellite pass on Harwick within the last 6 hours. I want thermal. And, General?" Claire's voice stopped him. He turned. "His treatment protocol needs to be updated before you take your medical team anywhere," she said. "If his respiratory function declines in the next 4 hours, Reyes needs to know exactly what to adjust and in what sequence. I need 20 minutes. Voss looked at her for a moment with the assessment of a man calculating multiple things at once. Then he said, 20 minutes, and was gone. She spent them at Marsh's bedside, going through the updated protocol with Reyes in the methodical, precise way that she'd learned early in her career, Shad. Not the way you explain things to people who knew less than you, but the way you explain things to someone competent who needed specific information quickly. Reyes listened well. He asked 2 good questions. He wrote nothing down because he'd clearly trained to retain verbal briefings, and he didn't need to. When she was done, he looked at her for a moment. "You're not a hospital nurse," he said. "Not an accusation. just a statement. I've been a hospital nurse for 6 years. That's not what I said. She picked up the chart from the bedside. Update his OBS every 15 minutes. If his SATs drop below 92, don't wait for the protocol threshold. Call it early. Reyes nodded. He didn't push. She found Voss in the hospital's small conference room off the administrative corridor, which had been converted into a tactical operations space with a speed that suggested his team had done this kind of conversion before. A map of the Dunmore Eastern Industrial District was on the table. Lund was on a satellite phone in the corner. Two operators she hadn't been introduced to stood at the map with the focused attention of people working a logistics problem. Thermal shows 16 bodies in the Hartwell complex, Lund said, dropping the phone. Mixed positions. Some stationary, which suggests guards. Some moving in a cluster, which suggests either a work team or hostages, Claire said. Everyone in the room looked at her. If Marsh was taken alive rather than killed, it's because someone wanted him to not be dead yet, she said. If they were just taking the drive, they didn't need him. If they took him too, there's a reason. And if they've been running an operation out of an industrial facility for 14 months, they have infrastructure and they have personnel. Personnel who might have also been taken. She looked at the map. Who else was in his convoy? A beat. 4 people, Voss said slowly. 2 field agents and 2 drivers. We assumed they were killed in the ambush. We found the vehicle, found evidence of casualties. But we didn't find all 4 bodies. How many didn't you find? 2. Claire looked at the thermal map on the tablet Lund had set down. 16 heat signatures. Some stationary, some moving together. When are you moving on the facility? She asked. We're still in the assessment. When? Voss looked at her. First light, 4 hours. What's your medical support configuration for the operation? 2 corpsmen and Reyes, assuming Marsh is stable enough to leave. You're going into a building that might have 2 or more people who've been held captive for 4 days by the same people who dosed Marsh with a classified nerve compound, and you have 2 corpsmen. We have 2 corpsmen and a physician. A physician who just learned the updated treatment protocol for VX7 exposure 20 minutes ago. Voss studied her. What are you asking? He said. I'm not asking anything, she said. I'm telling you that if your missing convoy personnel have been exposed to anything similar to what Marsh was exposed to, your current medical complement is under-resourced for triage and stabilization under field conditions. You haven't been in a field operation in 6 years. I know. It's not the same as a hospital rotation. I know that too. He held her gaze for a long moment. The 2 operators at the map had gone carefully still in the way of people pretending not to listen. I'll need a kit, she said. Whatever your corpsmen are carrying, I need a matching setup, and I need to review whatever your entry plan looks like before we move. Voss said nothing for 3 seconds. Then he turned to one of the operators. Get her a kit, yet. The 4 hours before first light were the kind of hours that didn't resolve into a clear shape in memory later, a compressed sequence of activity that bypassed the normal experience of time and deposited you at the end of it changed in ways you couldn't fully account for. Claire moved through them on the particular focused energy of someone whose body had decided that sleep was not relevant to the current situation. She checked on Marsh twice. His condition was holding. Reyes had the protocol and was executing it well, and she adjusted one variable in the second hour based on a respiratory trend she didn't like. And after that, the numbers moved in the right direction, and she left him to it. She reviewed the entry plan with Voss's lead operator, a rangy, quiet man named Kovacs, who briefed with the economy of someone who'd planned a significant number of operations and had no interest in performing thoroughness for its own sake. She asked 3 questions. He answered 2 of them completely and the third partially, which told her what the operation's current uncertainty margins were. She didn't push on the third one. She went through the medical kit twice. Inventory, then sequence, organizing by scenario rather than by category, the way she'd learned to do in conditions where you couldn't always reach for what you wanted and had to know where everything was by position rather than by sight. At some point, Marcus found her in the hallway outside the converted conference room and handed her a cup of coffee without saying anything. She took it and drank half of it and handed the cup back. Are you going somewhere? He asked. Yes. Is it dangerous? She considered the honest answer versus the kind answer and decided they were the same answer. Yes. He nodded slowly. You saved that man's life tonight, he said. Pryor would have let him die. I want you to know that I know that. She looked at him. I should have said something earlier, he said. On the floor, when he was... He stopped. I should have backed you up. You'd have lost your job. Yeah. He held her gaze. Still. She wanted to tell him it was all right, that she understood, that she'd never blamed him. All of those things were true, but they were also the easy things to say, and she'd spent enough time in situations where the easy things to say weren't the things that mattered. When this is over, she said, document everything you observed tonight. Pryor's instruction to you, his actions with the patient in bed 3, the timeline, everything. For what? For the record, she said. Make sure it's accurate and make sure it exists. He nodded again, more slowly. Claire, what are you? She picked up her kit. I used to be something else, she said. Tonight it turns out I still am. She left him in the hallway. The Hartwell complex sat at the end of a dead-end service road behind 3 blocks of shuttered manufacturing buildings, invisible from the main road and from above, unless you knew what a decommissioned facility with active thermal signatures looked like. Claire had looked at the satellite imagery long enough to build a spatial map in her head. 4 main structures, 2 connected by an interior corridor, a central yard that served as both a staging area and apparently a vehicle pool, 8 vehicles of various types. The thermal imaging had resolved to 17 signatures in the revised pass, not 16, 17. The discrepancy bothered her. She sat in the second vehicle of the convoy as it moved through the pre-dawn Dunmore streets, with Kovacs in front and 2 operators behind her and her kit on the seat beside her, and she turned the discrepancy over. 16 signatures in the first pass, 17 in the revised pass. One person had moved in from outside the complex between the 2 imaging windows. Or one person had been in a position that made them thermally invisible to the first pass, a subterranean space, a heavily insulated area, and had moved to a visible position. Or someone had arrived. She leaned forward. Kovac. Hartwell. The count changed between imaging passes, 16 to 17. I saw that. Who's the 17th? Unclear. Could be a personnel rotation, could be a late arrival. He said it without particular concern, which meant either he'd assessed it and found it didn't change the operational calculus, or he hadn't weighted it as significant. She wanted to know which. If Corvin burned this location after Marsh communicated it, then he may have sent additional security before we got here, Kovacs said. He had heard the concern she hadn't fully articulated, which we've factored in as a contingency. She wanted to ask what the contingency was. She decided that wasn't the most useful thing to do with the next 6 minutes. The convoy slowed at the end of the approach road. The facility was dark except for 2 exterior lights at the main vehicle entrance, the flat, functional lighting of a building that was trying not to advertise itself as occupied. She could see the silhouette of a vehicle parked at the gate, 1 visible guard. Kovac keyed his radio. All elements, stand by, initiating on my mark in 3 minutes. He turned and looked at her. You stay with the secondary team until the building is secure, he said. When I call medical forward, you move, not before. Understood. If the situation changes and you have to move independently, do not be in front of any threshold you haven't verified. I know. He held her gaze for a moment. Something passed through his expression, not exactly doubt, and not exactly its opposite, more like a recalibration. Voss said you were the best casualty management operator he'd ever seen in an uncontrolled environment, Kovacs said. He also said you disappeared for 6 years and he never understood why. She looked at the dark building at the end of the road. I had my reasons, she said. Yeah. He turned back to the windshield. People usually do. The radio clicked. All elements, Kovacs said. Mark. The vehicles began to move, and as the complex rose up in the headlights, Claire saw something that made her hand close around her kit strap with a tightness that wasn't in the plan. A figure moving at the far edge of the exterior, not toward the gate, not toward the visible guard, but toward the rear of the building's secondary structure with the purposeful, unhurried walk of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Alone. Moving away from the entry point, moving toward the section of the building the thermal imaging had identified as the location of the clustered signatures. The hostages. Kovacs, she said. I see him. He's going to the hostages before you breach the front. I see him, Hartwell. But the convoy was committed to the front approach. The timing was locked, and the figure at the far exterior was already rounding the corner of the secondary structure and disappearing from sight. And she looked at Kovac and knew what he was calculating. Peel one element from the primary approach to pursue the single figure, or hold the plan and accept the risk. Hold the plan was the safer tactical answer. Hold the plan might get the hostages killed. The convoy stopped at the gate. Operators were already moving, and Claire was already looking at the distance between her door and the rear of the secondary structure, and the time on the clock, and the specific probability that nobody in this convoy was going to be free to follow that figure for the next 4 minutes. She opened her door. Hartwell, Kovac said. 4 minutes, she said. Front entry takes 4 minutes to secure the gate and breach the primary structure. That's 4 minutes for whoever just went around the back to do whatever they went there to do. She held his gaze across the seat. How many hostages? A beat. Potentially 2, he said. Then you know where I'm going, she said. And she went. The ground was wet gravel and broken asphalt, and she moved across it fast but not recklessly, keeping the bulk of the secondary structure between herself and the main gate where the operators were already hitting the guard post. She heard the brief, controlled sounds of the front breach behind her. Not gunfire yet, just the compressed noise of a fast-moving entry. And she kept her eyes on the corner where the figure had disappeared. No kit on her back. She'd left the medical bag in the vehicle. That had been a mistake, and she knew it the moment her feet hit the gravel. But going back for it cost time she'd already spent, so she filed the mistake and kept moving. The corner of the secondary structure was a blind angle, and she slowed before she reached it, pressing against the exterior wall and listening for 4 seconds before she looked. The wall was cold concrete, industrial construction, the kind that absorbed the damp and gave nothing back. She could hear the rain on the roof overhead. It hadn't stopped, had just changed character in the hours since the hospital, from a downpour to a steady, determined presence. And underneath it, when she listened past it, footsteps, unhurried, moving away from her toward a door at the far end of the structure. She came around the corner. The figure was 20 meters ahead. Male, she assessed, medium build, civilian clothing, no visible weapon in his right hand, though his left was at an angle that suggested he might be carrying something against his body. Moving toward a utility entrance with a keypad lock, moving with the practiced ease of someone who knew the code. She didn't have a weapon. This was the second mistake she was currently managing. The utility door opened and the figure went through it, and she covered the 20 meters in 11 seconds and caught the door on the hydraulic close before it latched, easing it back with a pressure that wouldn't make a sound, and followed him in. The interior of the secondary structure was darker than the outside. Emergency lighting only, strips of dim yellow along the floor that gave enough to navigate but not enough to read. She was in what had been, in the facility's operational life, a secondary manufacturing corridor, a long space with equipment bays on either side, most of them empty. The floor marked with the ghost outlines of machinery that had been removed. The air smelled of concrete and old machine oil and something else that she placed after 2 steps. The particular flat chemical smell of a space that had been recently occupied by people who weren't moving around much. The figure was 20 feet ahead, moving down the corridor toward a set of double doors at the far end. He hadn't looked back. She followed. The double doors had a heavy bar lock on them, the industrial kind that bolted horizontally across both panels. As she watched, the figure lifted the bar, set it aside with care, and pushed through into the space beyond. She heard voices. Not a conversation. The involuntary, strained sounds of people being addressed against their will. A low murmur that had the specific quality of people trying not to provoke and not being sure they were succeeding. She reached the double doors. Through the gap she could see a large storage space, cleared of whatever it had formerly held, the floor bare concrete, the walls bare block. In the center of the room, seated against the far wall with their wrists zip-tied to a horizontal pipe running at floor level, were 2 people. A man and a woman, both in civilian clothes, both with the deteriorated appearance of people who'd been held without adequate food, water, or sleep for several days. The figure from the corridor was standing over them now. He had a phone in his hand, its screen providing a flat white light that made the scene look clinical, stripped of shadow. He was speaking quietly, too quiet for her to make out words through the door gap, and the two hostages were looking at him with an alertness that was fighting through exhaustion. The look of people who'd learned to track the intentions of whoever was in front of them as a survival strategy. She needed to know what he was doing before she moved. She watched for 6 seconds. The man crouched down, brought the phone closer to the hostages' faces, and she realized what she was looking at. He was taking photographs, not threatening them, photographing them. She pushed through the door. "Step back," she said. The figure spun around. He was younger than she'd thought from his walk, mid-30s, with a narrow, angular face that was currently running through a rapid calculation. His hands came up reflexively, the phone still in one of them, and he took 2 steps backward without being told to, which told her something. "Who are you?" he said. "I asked first," she said. "Step back from them, further." He stepped back. His eyes went to the door behind her, then back to her, then to the hostages, and the calculation on his face became something more specific. "You're not Armistice," he said. "No." "Are you military?" "Back up against the wall," she said. He backed up against the wall. He did it without resistance, which was either compliance or strategy, and she didn't have enough information yet to determine which. She crossed to the hostages and crouched at their level, keeping the figure in her peripheral vision. The man against the wall, the closer one, was in his late 30s, white, with lacerations above one eye that had been cleaned at some point but not properly treated and had started to heal badly. The woman beside him was early 40s, with dark circles that went beyond tiredness into the physiological territory of sustained stress. Both were dehydrated. She could assess that from the skin quality and lip condition in about 4 seconds. Both were functional, alert, no signs of the chemical exposure that had hit Marsh. "Are you hurt beyond what I can see?" she asked. "My shoulder," the man said. His voice was rough from disuse. "Left. Something's wrong with it. I can't." He stopped, recalibrated. "Who are you?" "My name's Claire. There's a military team breaching the front of this building right now. Are there guards in this section?" "2," the woman said. She had a precise clip delivery that suggested she was managing her fear through systematic information delivery, which Claire respected. "They rotate every 2 hours. One just rotated out, maybe 20 minutes ago. The next rotation would be—" She glanced at the figure against the wall. "He came instead." "He's been watching you?" "He came 4 nights ago. He's been—" She stopped. "He says he's been protecting us." Claire looked at the figure against the wall. He was watching her with the focused attention of someone who had decided that speaking out of turn would not help him. "Who are you?" she said again. This time it wasn't rhetorical. "My name is Elliot Ferris," he said. "I was an analyst for Armistice Solutions. I quit 8 months ago. I've been trying to—" He exhaled. "I have information about Nathan Corvin, about everything. That's what I came here with." He held up the phone. "I've been documenting this facility for 3 weeks. I have evidence on this device that corroborates everything Marsh was carrying." The double doors behind her banged open. 2 of Kovach's operators came through fast, weapons up, and the situation in the room resolved itself in about 3 seconds. Operators swept the space, identified Claire and the hostages and Ferris. Weapons came to ready low. "Clear?" one of them said into his radio. "Medical forward," came Kovach's voice through the radio. "Secondary structure, south end." "Tell them I'm already here," Claire said. She was already working the zip ties. She didn't have a knife, so she was working the locking mechanism with a piece of metal she'd pulled from the equipment on her belt, which was slower and less elegant than cutting and was what she had. "Tell them I need a kit, and I need the shoulder assessed. Probable dislocation, possibly worse." One of the operators relayed it. The other one had moved to cover Ferris, who was standing against the wall with his hands visible and his phone held out in the universal gesture of not giving anyone a reason to do something drastic. "He's not hostile," Claire said, working the second tie. "Treat him as a witness." "I'll need to verify," the operator started. "I know. Verify carefully." She got the second tie free. The woman pulled her wrists apart and made a sound that wasn't quite pain and wasn't quite relief. The specific sound of circulation returning to hands that had been constrained for too long. "Can you stand?" "Yes." She stood unsteadily, using the pipe for leverage. Agents Raina Poole, D.I., and Sergeant First Class Derek Yoon. She nodded at the man beside her. We were the rear element of Marsh's convoy. I know. Do you need to be carried? No. She tested her legs, decided something, adjusted. I need to walk out of here and I need 5 minutes with whoever's in command. You'll have both. Claire turned to Yoon. He was upright but compromised. The left shoulder was sitting wrong. She could see it even through his jacket. The specific displacement of a joint that had been forced out of its proper alignment and hadn't been put back. He'd been managing it for 4 days, which meant the surrounding musculature had been in protective spasm for 4 days, which was going to make reduction significantly more painful and more difficult than it would have been immediately post-injury. When did it happen? She asked. During the ambush. Vehicle rolled. I landed on it wrong. Has anyone touched it since? One of them tried to pull me up by that arm on the second day. His expression communicated everything about how that had gone. Right. She felt around the joint through the jacket, reading the displacement angle, the muscle response to pressure, the range of what he could tolerate before his body started refusing the examination. I can't do a proper reduction here without imaging and analgesia. What I can do is a provisional realignment that'll get you out of this building and reduce the pressure enough to be ambulatory. It's going to hurt significantly. Do it. I need you to tell me if you feel any nerve symptoms, numbness, shooting pain down the arm, tingling in the fingers. None so far. That might change in the next 30 seconds. Okay? She did it efficiently and without preamble, the way she'd learned to do things in conditions where a pause to explain was a luxury that compounded the problem. He made a sound through closed teeth that he'd clearly been trying not to make, and his hand gripped the pipe he'd been tied to with a force that left marks on his palm. The joint seated with an imperfect provisional correctness that was better than where it had been and worse than where a proper reduction would put it. Nerve symptoms? She said immediately. No. Movement? He moved it, winced. Yes. Don't use it. Don't lift anything. Don't brace with it. Don't compensate with it. It needs to be imaged before anyone puts load on it. She looked at him steadily. I mean that. Yeah, he said. I got it. The medical kit arrived. One of the corpsmen came through the double doors with it. And she transitioned to the formal assessment, moving through both Poole and Yoon with a triage logic that was half protocol and half judgment, noting what she found and passing it in organized shorthand to the corpsman, who had a tablet and was logging as she went. Ferris was still against the wall. One of the operators had taken the phone from him, and he'd let it go without protest. He was watching Claire work with the expression of someone recalibrating a series of assumptions. You're not just medical support, he said. She kept her eyes on Yoon's vital assessment. Right now I am. I heard the way that operator talked to you when you came in. You gave them instructions. I gave them information. That's different. They listened. She took the BP cuff off Yoon's good arm. Numbers are low but manageable, she told the corpsman. Flag for IV fluids as soon as we're external. Renal function needs to be checked at the next level of care. She straightened and looked at Ferris. What's on the phone? Financial records. Transfer logs, routing numbers, account identifications. 3 months of Armistice Solutions internal communications. Corvin's correspondence with the operations director. He paused. Photographs of this facility at various stages of preparation. And the kill order. What kill order? The one Corvin issued 6 hours ago. His voice was flat and precise in the way that people sometimes got when they were controlling fear through factual delivery, which she recognized because she'd done it herself. For Marsh, for Poole and Yoon, and for me. He looked at her. They know I'm here. I was part of the operation for 2 years before I understood what I was actually part of. When I quit, Corvin flagged me as a liability. When I started documenting the facility, they started looking. He exhaled. They would have found me tonight if your people hadn't come when they did. Who else knows about the kill order? Corvin's direct reports. The security commander here, man named Briggs. He said the name was something that wasn't quite hatred but was in the same neighborhood. Briggs runs the physical operation at this site. He's the one who interrogated Marsh. The operator with the phone was already transmitting it via a device Claire didn't recognize. She looked at Poole, who was leaning against the wall with the carefully maintained upright posture of someone who was going to stay upright through determination rather than physical reserve. What did they want from you? Claire asked her. They wanted to know how much Marsh had transmitted before they took him, whether there was a backup beyond the physical drive. Her voice was even. We told them nothing. Did they use... Claire started. Not chemical, Poole said. She understood the question. They didn't use what they used on Marsh, standard interrogation methods. Difficult, but survivable. Her jaw tightened slightly. Marsh's exposure, was that deliberate? Appears so. Designed to be deniable, he would have presented as a trauma patient with ambiguous symptoms. Claire paused. He almost did. The attending physician was on Armistice's payroll. Something passed through Poole's expression. He was supposed to die there. Yes. But he didn't. No. Poole looked at her for a moment with an assessment that was specific and professional. What's your name again? Claire Hartwell. The name didn't produce a reaction in Poole, which was consistent with the cover she'd maintained. Then Poole said, What's your call sign? And the way she said it, the slight emphasis on call sign, the deliberate casualness of it, communicated that she was not asking a random question. I don't have one anymore, Claire said. Poole nodded slowly. Voss asked me something once, a few years ago. He was trying to locate an operator who'd gone off-grid. He said, and I remember this specifically because it was an unusual thing for him to say, he said, she's the best I've ever seen at keeping people alive in the worst possible circumstances, and she's also the most stubborn person I've encountered in 30 years of service. He couldn't find her. Poole held her gaze. He found her tonight. Claire looked at her for a moment. Then the radio cracked. This is Kovacs, all elements. We have a problem. North section of the primary structure. Briggs is in the north section with at least 4 personnel, and he has the drive. He has also a pause that had the quality of a man editing in real time. He has planted charges, multiple locations in the primary structure. We are receiving a live detonation threat via intercept. He is requesting extraction or he detonates. All elements, hold position. The room went very quiet. How long does he want? One of the operators said into his radio. He wants a vehicle and a route out, and he wants it in 20 minutes or he initiates. Claire looked at the 2 operators in the room, at Poole and Yoon, at Ferris against the wall. Is anyone else in the primary structure? She said into the radio. Static, then Kovacs. We have 4 of my people in a standoff position at the north section entrance. We also have confirmed 3 Armistice personnel who were taken into custody in the initial breach. They're in the East Bay, and we have... Another pause. We have Dr. Pryor. She went very still. Say again, she said. Dr. Wallace Pryor, your attending physician. He was brought here from the hospital approximately 2 hours ago. He is in the north section with Briggs. The first thought she had was tactical. Pryor was in the blast radius if Briggs detonated, and if Briggs had brought him here, it wasn't because he cared about his welfare. The second thought she had was the one she didn't let herself finish, because it was the one that was about 6 years of small humiliations and the specific quality of his voice when he said the word sparrow, and finishing that thought in the next 30 seconds wasn't going to help anything. He's leverage, Kovacs said, as though reading her. Briggs knows we can trace the payments to Pryor. He's keeping Pryor alive because a dead co-conspirator is evidence. A live one is a bargaining chip. That only holds if Briggs thinks he's getting out, Claire said. Which is why we're telling him he is, Kovacs said. But I need 20 minutes to stage the extraction route, and I need my people not to have to manage a medical emergency in the middle of a hostage standoff. He paused. Poole and Yoon need to be moved. Your corpsman needs to be with them. That leaves me thin on medical support for the north section if this goes wrong. It's going to go wrong, Claire said. I know, Kovacs said. That's why I'm talking to you. She looked at the room. She looked at Yoon's shoulder and Poole's deteriorated condition and the corpsman between them, and she did the math that there was only one way to do. How do I get to the north section without going through Briggs's field of visibility? She said. A 3-second pause. Then Kovacs said, I'm sending you the layout now, and her operator's tablet lit up with a floor plan. She studied it for 30 seconds. The East Bay custodial access, she said. It connects to the north section through the original manufacturing infrastructure. Overhead service corridor. She traced the route on the tablet. I can reach the north section from above. The The service corridor hasn't been used since the facility went dark, Kovacs said. We don't have structural verification. I weigh 132 pounds. That's not exactly... What I'm hearing, she said, is that nobody else has come up with a different route. A pause. The custodial access hatch is on the east wall of the bay, Kovacs said, 12 feet up. You'll need a boost. I have people, she said, and looked at the operator beside her. He looked back at her with the specific expression of someone who had been in enough unusual situations to have stopped being surprised by them, and said, I can get you to 12 feet. The East Bay smelled worse than the secondary structure. The concentrated accumulation of a space that had been housing several people involuntarily for 4 days. And the 3 Armistice personnel in custody were zip-tied and seated along the south wall under the watch of a single operator, who gave Claire a nod that communicated he'd been briefed and was managing. The custodial access hatch was exactly where the floor plan showed it. A metal panel, industrial construction, hinged at the top, with a manual release that hadn't been opened in over a year based on the corrosion pattern. The operator boosted her up without comment, and she worked the release for 45 seconds before it gave, and then she was through it and into the service corridor. The service corridor was not comfortable. It was approximately 4 feet wide and 3 feet high, which meant moving through it required a specific kind of forward progress that was neither crawling nor crouching, but something in between, weight distributed across hands and knees on a metal surface that flexed slightly with each placement. The flex was consistent with structural fatigue, but not with imminent failure. And she moved steadily rather than stopping to analyze it, because stopping to analyze it was not going to make the metal less fatigued. She had her kit now. The corpsman had handed it up through the hatch before she moved, and it was slung across her back and shifted with each movement in ways she was managing rather than correcting. From below and ahead, she could hear the standoff. Not the words. Not yet. She was still 30 meters from the north section, and the sound was filtered through metal and concrete. But she could hear the particular acoustic texture of a situation that was holding but not comfortably. Periodic voice exchanges with the flat effect of people talking to each other across a distance they were both maintaining. She reached the point above the East Bay connection to the north section and stopped. Below her, through a ventilation grill that was designed for airflow rather than visibility but was sufficient for both, she could see a portion of the north section floor. Briggs was visible at the far end, a large man, broad through the shoulders, moving with the restless energy of someone who knew the timeline was running and was managing the pressure through motion rather than stillness. He had a radio in one hand and a phone in the other, and he was watching the corridor entrance where Kovac's people were staged. He had 3 people with him. 2 were positioned at the corridor entrance with weapons. The third was closer to Briggs, and he was keeping someone, near him. Pryor. From this angle, through the grill, she could see him clearly enough to read the condition. He was standing, which meant he wasn't injured in a way that had taken him off his feet. His jacket was torn at the left shoulder. His face, even from this height and angle, had the specific texture of someone who had spent the last several hours understanding, with increasing specificity, what he had gotten himself into. She could also see the charges, 3 that were visible from her angle. Compact devices attached to the support columns at regular intervals, with a wireless trigger configuration she recognized from the general category and didn't need to identify more precisely than that. Briggs had his thumb near a device on his belt. Not on it. Near it. The difference between those 2 positions was everything. She moved forward another 4 meters along the service corridor and found what she'd been looking for, an access panel that opened downward into the north section. The floor plan had marked it as a maintenance drop point, designed for equipment access. It was approximately 7 feet above the north section floor. She assessed the drop, the landing surface, the distance to cover between landing and the nearest support column, the timing window relative to Briggs's attention on the entrance corridor. She assessed her kit weight and how it would affect the landing. She assessed the angle of Briggs's thumb relative to the trigger device. None of it was favorable enough to be called good. All of it was workable. Her radio earpiece clicked once. The prearranged signal from Kovacs that the extraction vehicle was pulling up to the north entrance. Briggs's attention would go to the entrance for approximately 45 seconds as he verified. She had the panel open before the click finished. She dropped. The 7-foot landing on concrete was the kind that absorbed up through the knees and hips in a way that would announce itself to her the next morning, and she was already moving on the rebound, using the momentum to cover ground rather than spending it on recovery. She reached the nearest support column in 3 seconds and pressed against it, listening. Briggs was at the north entrance, radio up, talking to Kovacs. His back was mostly to her. His 2 armed personnel were watching the corridor, which meant their backs were also mostly to her. The third one, the one who'd been near Briggs, had turned toward the sound of her landing. He was looking directly at her. He was 19 years old at the most, young enough that she processed it as a data point rather than a moral consideration in the moment. A young man with a weapon pointed in her direction, and the specific frozen quality of someone who hadn't expected to encounter another variable and wasn't sure what to do with it. "Don't," she said, quietly, evenly. His eyes went to the medical kit on her back. She watched him process it. And in that 2-second window of him processing what a woman with a medical kit rather than a weapon dropping from the ceiling meant, she heard Briggs's voice rise sharply from the entrance as something in the extraction negotiation went wrong. She didn't catch the words, just the register, the spike of it. And his hand came down to the trigger device on his belt. The young man in front of her swung toward the sound. Briggs looked back into the room. And Wallace Pryor, who had been standing near the support column with the specific stillness of someone trying to be invisible, made the only decision that she would never fully understand and never entirely stop thinking about. He moved toward Briggs with the lurching, desperate momentum of a man who had calculated nothing except that the moment was happening and he was in it. He collided with Briggs at the belt. The trigger device skittered across the floor, and the north section entrance exploded with the sound of Kovac's team breaching. The breach was loud and fast and over in about 12 seconds. Kovac's team came through the north entrance in 2 stacks, moved to cover positions with the automatic precision of people who had trained for this until the choreography was reflex, and the 2 armed armistice personnel at the entrance made the correct calculation that resistance would cost them more than they were willing to spend. Weapons went down. Hands went up. The whole thing was sufficiently controlled that Claire, pressed against the support column with the young man in front of her still undecided, had the bandwidth to register all of it before she needed to act. "Down," she said to the young man. "On your knees, hands visible. Now." He went down. She moved toward Briggs. Briggs was on the floor where Pryor's collision had put him, still fighting. Not a tactical fight, not a trained response, but the raw physical resistance of a large man who wasn't ready to be finished. He had Pryor's jacket in one fist and was using it in a way that had already turned Pryor's face toward the concrete. Kovac's people were converging, but there were the 2 disarmed personnel to manage simultaneously, and the geometry of the room was briefly unfavorable. Claire reached Briggs before the operators did. She didn't try to subdue him. She wasn't equipped or positioned to subdue a man who outweighed her by 60 pounds and was currently running on the specific adrenaline of someone who understood the consequences of being taken. What she did was put her knee on the hand that was reaching for the drop trigger device, which had skidded to within 2 feet of him during the struggle, and she put her weight behind it in a way that ground the bones in his hand against the concrete with sufficient force to make the reach not worth completing. Briggs made a sound. "Let him go," she said. He let go of Pryor. The operators reached them, and the next 4 seconds were the controlled chaos of a room being secured, Briggs being pulled up and cuffed with a speed that suggested the operators had opinions about him, Pryor being checked and found bruised but structurally intact, the trigger device being secured by Kovacs personally, who looked at it for 3 seconds with the expression of a man doing arithmetic he'd rather not be doing. "The charges are still live," Kovacs said. "I know." His phone was the secondary trigger. "My EOD element is external." He was already on the radio. "We need them in here in the next, how long to disarm? 5 minutes per device if nothing is booby-trapped. 15 if any of them are." "How many devices?" "Building-wide? We found 9. We think." He said think with a precision that communicated it was not a word he was using carelessly. The EOD team came through from outside in the next 90 seconds. She heard them, then saw them. 4 people moving with the specific unhurried speed of professionals who had decided that hurrying around explosives was a form of self-defeating logic. They fanned out immediately, the lead member taking Kovac's briefing in the clipped shorthand of people who'd exchanged information under pressure before. Briggs was on his knees against the wall with two operators flanking him, and he was doing the thing that people in his position sometimes did. Talking. Not cooperating exactly, not confessing, but filling the silence with the particular verbal static of someone who thought that words were still a form of leverage and hadn't updated that assumption. "You've got nothing on me that sticks," he said. "Chain of evidence from an unsanctioned military operation. No warrants, no civilian oversight. That's a concern for later," Kovac said, without looking at him. "Corvin will have the operation buried before you get back to your vehicle. You think you've got something? He has people in every oversight channel. Everyone." "Good to know," Kovac said, in the tone of someone receiving information they already had. Briggs looked at Claire. Something in his face shifted. Not remorse, not fear exactly, but the recalibration of a man who was trying to figure out which variable had changed the outcome. She was the variable he'd identified. "Who are you?" he said. She was already crouching over the trigger device Kovac had secured, not touching it, reading the construction from 2 inches away. "She's not talking to you," one of the operators said. "Wireless trigger," Claire said to Kovac. "The construction is non-standard. The primary detonator and the backup are on different frequencies." Kovac looked at her. "Whoever built this didn't want a signal-blocking environment to disarm the whole system at once," she said. "You can jam one frequency and not the other. Your EOD team needs to know." Kovac passed it to his EOD lead immediately. There was a brief radio exchange, and then the EOD lead said something that had a different quality to it than what came before. A confirmation that carried the particular weight of that changes things. And she heard the team's pace adjust accordingly. Pryor was sitting against the support column she'd landed beside, which had a black irony she wasn't going to spend energy on right now. His jacket was torn. There was blood on his lower lip from where his face had met the floor. He was watching her with an expression she'd never seen on him before, which was appropriate because she'd never seen him in a situation that had stripped away every layer of the constructed authority he wore like structural support. Without it, he looked like what he was. A man who'd made very bad decisions for money and had just come into contact with their full weight. She crouched in front of him and checked his pupils, both equal, both reactive, then checked his tracking and his responses, a 45-second neurological screening that she did with the same professional thoroughness she'd brought to his patients for 6 years, because she wasn't going to do it worse for him than she would have done it for anyone else. That mattered to her in a way she couldn't fully explain, but also didn't need to. "Any numbness? Vision changes? Loss of time?" "No," he said. His voice was rough. "Head hit the floor?" "Yes." "Where?" He indicated. She examined it. A minor laceration, superficial, already clotting. No deformation, no structural concern. "You'll need imaging to rule out concussion," she said. "But you're not deteriorating. Don't sleep for the next 4 hours without someone checking on you." He looked at her. She stood up and moved away before he could say whatever he was about to say. The EOD team cleared the building in 31 minutes. Not because the charges were simple, they weren't, but because the frequency intelligence Claire had flagged from the trigger device turned out to be accurate and had allowed the EOD lead to approach the secondary detonators in the right sequence, rather than discovering the configuration the expensive way. She found this out from Kovacs 40 minutes later, relayed with the specific brevity of a man who communicated appreciation through information transfer rather than through anything that resembled gratitude. 2 of the devices had secondary triggers that would have responded to a standard jamming sweep, he said. "Your read was correct." "I got lucky on the angle," she said. "You got lucky on the angle," he said, with the exact inflection that meant he didn't believe her. She let it stand. The medical priority in the aftermath was Poole and Yoon. They'd been moved to the external staging area during the standoff, and the corpsmen had them on fluids, which was the correct call. But Yoon's shoulder needed more attention than field conditions were providing, and Poole had developed a low fever in the hours since her release, which was the body finally processing 4 days of stress and inadequate hydration, and could be straightforward, or could be the beginning of something that needed intervention. She monitored both of them, adjusted the fluid rates, and made the call to transport as soon as the site was fully secured. Ferris was in the custody of Voss's intelligence team, not arrested, not free, somewhere in the middle space of a person who was both a witness and a former participant, and who had enough documentation on his phone to be simultaneously valuable and complicated. She'd seen him briefly during the building clearance, sitting in a vehicle with an agent on either side and his hands in his lap, and the expression of someone who had made a decision he was still in the process of understanding the consequences of. The drive back to Hargrove Peak took 20 minutes. She spent most of it in the second vehicle, monitoring Yoon, who had fallen into the shallow dozing of physical exhaustion and came awake every time the vehicle hit a rough patch and then went back under. She updated the handoff notes for the receiving team, organized the documentation from the past several hours in the way that would make it most useful to whoever was going to need it, and ate the energy bar that one of the operators had handed her at some point and that she'd been carrying in her jacket pocket for 2 hours. It tasted like compressed chalk, and she ate the entire thing. Marsh was stable when they got back to the hospital. Reyes had maintained the protocol correctly throughout, adjusting one variable based on a respiratory trend in exactly the window she'd have chosen, and the colonel was conscious, genuinely, sustainedly conscious, not the fragile 4-second lucidity from the early hours, but actual awareness, able to track, able to respond, monitoring his own condition the way trained personnel did when they were hurt but functional. Voss was at his bedside when Claire arrived. Marsh looked at her with the deliberateness of someone making sure he was looking at the right person. "You're the one from the ER," he said. "Yes. I remember." He stopped. "I remember the needle. And a voice. That was me." He looked at her for a moment. "Thank you," had the quality of something he'd said before in circumstances where it wasn't adequate and had learned to say anyway because the alternatives were worse. "How's your breathing?" she asked. "Better than it was. I need to add one component to your current protocol based on your respiration trend over the last 2 hours." She was already looking at the monitor. "It should help with the residual bronchospasm. Dr. Reyes will administer it." "Okay," Marsh said. And then, after a pause, "Corvin, does Voss know about Corvin?" "We know," Voss said. He said it with a weight that meant more than confirmation. Marsh let out a slow breath. "How long?" "We've suspected for 7 weeks. We had nothing solid until tonight." "How much access has he had?" "In the gap between you suspecting and tonight." Voss said nothing for a moment, which was itself an answer. "He's been managing the search," Marsh said. It wasn't a question. "We believe so." Marsh closed his eyes briefly. "He has people across 6 oversight divisions. I found that much before the convoy hit. It's in the financial documentation." He opened his eyes. "The drive. Ferris has corroborating documentation," Voss said. "It may be sufficient to—" "The drive is the primary evidence, the evidence that puts names to the financial transfers at the origination level, not the distribution level. Ferris's documentation supports it, but doesn't replace it." He looked at Voss steadily. "Briggs had it." "Briggs doesn't have it anymore." "I know." Marsh shifted slightly on the bed, and the discomfort was visible, but he worked through it. "Did you find it on him?" Voss was quiet. "You didn't find it on him," Marsh said. "His people are being processed. He moved it before you got to him," Marsh said. "That's what he was doing in the north section, securing the drive separately from his personnel." His jaw tightened. "He's not stupid. He knew if he was taken, anything on his person was immediately compromised. He would have had a separate custody arrangement." The room was quiet for a moment. 1719, Claire said. Both men looked at her. When he was barely conscious, he said Corvin and then 1719. I assumed it was the facility address. She looked at Marsh. "Is that what it was?" Marsh was silent for 3 seconds. Then, "There's a storage unit." He said it with the specific quality of a man selecting words carefully because the information was classified even now, even in this room. An off-site cold storage unit used by the Intelligence Division for physical evidence backup. It's registered under a procurement shell. The unit number is 1719. "Is it at the Harwick facility address?" Voss said. "No, it's in the city. East side, commercial storage block near the river." He looked at Voss. "But if Briggs knew about it, if Corvin burned that location to Briggs as an emergency dead drop—" "He moved the drive there during the 4 days he had you," Voss said. "And now Corvin knows we have Briggs, and he knows the Harwick facility is compromised, and he has—" Marsh checked the clock on the wall. A window of maybe 4 hours before retrieval becomes too dangerous. Voss was already onto radio. Massen. The storage facility was a commercial block 8 blocks from the river. 3 rows of climate-controlled units in a converted warehouse that had been doing legitimate business since the early 2000s and had no idea it was currently housing the central evidence in a federal conspiracy case. Voss's people reached it in under 20 minutes, secured the exterior, and began the process of identifying the unit with a methodical speed that was appropriate, and also, in the current timeline, nerve-wracking. Claire was not at the storage facility. She was at Hargrove Peak, monitoring Marsh and coordinating the ongoing treatment of Poole and Yoon, because that was the job she'd agreed to, and because taking Marsh off the current protocol to hand it to someone with less context struck her as a bad decision at the wrong moment. She followed the operation via the radio feed Kovacs had left with her, not because she had a tactical role in it, but because she was, at this point, woven into the event at enough levels that staying informed was just practical management. The unit was found and secured at 5:40 a.m. The drive was in it. She heard the confirmation in Voss's voice and filed it, went back to Marsh's obs, adjusted the protocol timing by 4 minutes based on what she was seeing in the respiratory trend, and told Reyes to monitor the next 2 cycles closely. Reyes did. She went to the break room, where, it turned out, most of the hospital staff who'd been confined for interviews had been released back to duty over the last 2 hours, and found the coffee maker and made a cup that was bad in the specific way of institutional coffee makers at 6 in the morning and drank it standing at the counter. Marcus came in while she was finishing it. He looked like someone who had been awake for 23 hours and had processed more in those 23 hours than in the previous 6 months combined. He stood in the doorway for a moment, then came to the counter and started the machine again. "Pryor is in custody," he said. "I know. They took him from the triage area about 40 minutes ago. Federal agents. Not hospital security. Actual federal agents." He paused. A lot of the staff watched it happen. She looked at her empty cup. "A lot of the staff," Marcus said, "had some things to say about it." "What kind of things?" "The kind that people say when something they've suspected for a long time turns out to be true, and the relief of it is complicated." He got his coffee and turned to face her. "That doesn't cover it, actually. It was less relief and more," he thought about it, "more like something had been wrong with the building for a long time and someone had finally identified the structural fault." She understood that. "There are going to be investigators here for weeks," she said. "Months, probably. They're going to want statements from everyone who worked under Pryor. The documentation I asked you to prepare." "Already done," he said. "I did it at 3 a.m. She nodded. "Claire?" He held his coffee with both hands, looking at the counter. "What happens to the hospital? To the ER?" "I don't know." The honest answer, and the only useful one. "Someone will be acting chief while the administration processes everything. It'll be disruptive for a while." "Will you come back?" She looked at the empty cup in her hands. It was a plain white ceramic mug with a hairline crack along the rim that had been there for as long as she could remember, and she'd drunk out of it a few hundred times at least, and the crack had never gotten worse or better. "I don't know that either," she said. On. At 7:15 a.m., Nathan Corvin was taken into custody at his home 20 minutes outside Dunmore. She heard the confirmation through Lund, who relayed it with the satisfaction of someone who had spent weeks building a case that had just achieved its object. Corvin had apparently been at his kitchen table when they arrived, not attempting to flee, not preparing to, either because he'd miscalculated the timeline or because he'd made a different calculation entirely. He'd said nothing to the arresting agents beyond asking to see identification, which was simultaneously the correct legal response and the response of a man who understood that the time for anything else had passed. Voss came back to the hospital at 8 a.m. He looked like someone who had been operating continuously for over 12 hours and had made a decision not to be visibly affected by it. He found Claire in the corridor outside Marsh's room and stopped, and they stood there for a moment in the way of 2 people who had been through a large amount of shared experience in a very short window and were now on the other side of it. "Corvin had a lawyer on the phone before the transport vehicle left his driveway," Voss said. "Of course he did. He's going to fight this. His people are already pushing a narrative about procedural violations in the evidence collection." "The drive? The drive is clean. The chain of custody from Ferris's documentation is clean." The financial records tying the armistice payments to Pryor's accounts are clean. He paused. Briggs has decided that cooperation is in his interest, which it is, and he's been specific about Corvin's direct authorization of the convoy ambush and Marsh's abduction. Another pause. It'll hold. She looked at the floor for a moment, then back at him. You know what I want to ask you, she said, about why I didn't find you sooner. You knew where I was. I've been at this hospital for 6 years. I knew, he said. I knew, and I made a decision to leave it alone. He said it with the evenness of a man who had arrived at this conversation from a long distance and had prepared for it. You resigned. You were entitled to a civilian life. I didn't have a case that required you, and I wasn't going to pull you back into an operational context for something that didn't require it. And this required it. You were already in it, he said. You'd already saved him. I didn't put you in the situation, Claire. Pryor did. I just found you standing in the parking lot with your shoes already wet. It was honest. She gave him that. Marsh wants to speak with you before he's transported, Voss said. When you have a moment. She nodded and moved past him toward the room. Marsh was more present than he'd been at any point in the previous 8 hours, still with the pallor of someone who'd been fighting a chemical insult to his nervous system, still with the careful movements of a body that was working on recovery rather than function, but genuinely, sustainedly present. He watched her come in and waited until she'd checked the monitor before he said anything. Sit down, he said. Please. She sat in the chair at the bedside. I've been briefed, he said, on everything that happened at Harwick, and on tonight, before that, in this building. She waited. You treated me before you knew who I was, he said, before there was any reason beyond the medical assessment. That's the job, she said. Pryor didn't see it that way. Pryor had other priorities. Marsh was quiet for a moment. I've been doing intelligence work for 16 years, he said. I've been in situations where I was dependent on someone else's competence and where that competence was the whole margin between... He paused, and she understood he was editing, choosing the version that was accurate without being gratuitous. You made a decision in that ER without any of the contextual information I'm telling you now. You made it because your assessment was right, and because you acted on it when the institutional authority told you not to. I knew I'd lose the job, she said. I wasn't sure about the rest. And you did it anyway. The enzyme pattern was clear enough. He looked at her steadily. I'm not talking about the enzyme pattern, he said. She held his gaze. The drive contains financial documentation going back 3 years, he said. Payments, routing chains, authorization signatures. It names Corvin, the armistice executive structure, 3 government procurement officials, and... He stopped. And 18 other recipients, 12 of whom are in positions with direct oversight of military medical programs. She processed the expansion of that. Medical programs, she said. Research funding, procurement contracts. The VX7 program wasn't an outlier. It was one product in a larger pipeline that's been running for at least 5 years. It needed legitimate medical infrastructure to test certain components, and it needed people in key positions to look in the wrong direction at the right times. He held her gaze. Some of those people were physicians. How far does it go? The evidence on the drive covers this region specifically. There are parallel investigations in 2 other regions that we believe connect to the same network. He paused. This isn't over tonight. Tonight was a corner of it. She sat with that. Why are you telling me this? She said. Because Voss is going to make you an offer in the next hour, Marsh said. And I want you to have the full context when he does. He adjusted slightly on the bed, and she could see him managing the discomfort. And because you're owed the truth. You made a decision in that ER without any of it, and you were right, and you're owed the truth. She looked at the monitor. The numbers were good, better than they'd been, tracking in the right direction. Get some rest, she said. Your respiratory function is improved, but the cellular recovery from the exposure takes days. Don't push the timeline. That's not a response to what I said. No, she said. It's not. She stood up and was at the door when he said, Ghost. She turned. He said it with the specific weight of someone using a word that had more history than 4 letters could carry. Not a call sign, not a designation. Something else. Something closer to a recognition. Whatever you decide, he said. You're owed the context. You were right. You've always been right. That matters. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she walked back into the corridor, where Voss was waiting, and where the morning had arrived without her noticing, the light coming through the hospital windows in the specific flat gray of early dawn after rain. She was going to need a change of clothes. She was going to need about 14 hours of sleep. She was going to need, at some point, to sit with everything that had happened tonight and understand what it had done to the shape of the 6 years that preceded it and what it meant for whatever came next. Voss fell into step beside her. "I have something to ask you," he said. "I know." He looked at her. "Give me an hour," she said. "I need to finish Marsh's handoff notes and check on Poole and Yoon and make sure Reyes has everything he needs for the morning transition." She kept walking. "Then I'll hear it." He nodded, and she moved down the corridor toward the nurse's station, and behind her she heard him stop, heard the specific quality of a man who had found what he'd been looking for and was content, for the moment, to wait. She reached the station. She pulled up Marsh's chart. She was 3 lines into the handoff notes when her phone buzzed. Not a personal number, not the hospital extension, but the device Voss's team had issued her during the operation, which should not have been receiving communications at this stage. She looked at the screen. The message was 4 words, and they had no sender identification. "He isn't what Voss says." She read the message 3 times. "He isn't what Voss says." No sender, no follow-up. The device timestamp showed it had arrived 40 seconds ago, which meant whoever sent it had either anticipated she'd be at the nurse's station at this moment or had been watching and sent it when she stopped moving. She turned slowly and looked down the corridor. Voss was standing where she'd left him, 20 feet away, speaking quietly into his own radio. He hadn't looked up. 2 of his operators were at the far end of the hallway, stationed at the stairwell. The overnight staff moved around them with the adapted normalcy of people who had decided that military personnel in their hospital was just Tuesday now. She looked at the message again. "He isn't what Voss says." Voss had said Marsh was a defense intelligence officer running a financial investigation. Marsh had said Voss was going to make her an offer. Everything in the last 8 hours had been structured around the assumption that these 2 men were on the same side of the same operation, and that the operation was what it appeared to be. She thought about the 4-second window of lucidity in the ER. They found me. They always find me. She thought about the discrepancy in the thermal count. 1 additional person arriving at the facility in the window between imaging passes. She thought about Marsh's careful specificity when he told her about the drive. The information that felt offered rather than disclosed. The way he'd named the storage unit location without her asking for it. The way he'd framed the evidence in terms that positioned him as the sole authoritative interpreter of what it contained. She thought about the things she knew versus the things she'd been told. The ratio was uncomfortably skewed. She pocketed the device and walked back toward Voss. He finished his radio exchange and turned to face her. "Ready?" "Not yet." She kept her voice level. "There's something I need to understand first." "Of course." Marsh told me the drive contains evidence connecting 18 individuals in military medical program oversight. He said there are parallel investigations in 2 other regions. She watched his face. "That's a significant expansion of what you briefed me on in the parking lot." "He told you that?" "Is it accurate?" Voss studied her for a moment. "Yes." "Then why wasn't it in the initial briefing?" "Because the initial briefing was at 11:50 p.m. in a parking lot with an active extraction situation developing. I gave you what you needed for the immediate—" "I'm not criticizing the decision," she said. "I'm asking whether the full picture changed your assessment of who the principal threat is." She held his gaze. "Because there's a version of this where the drive is the most important object in the region right now, and where the people who most need to control the interpretation of what's on it are not the people who are supposed to be dismantling the network." Voss was very still. "Someone sent me a message on your team's device," she said. 4 words. Anonymous. Suggesting that Marsh isn't what you've told me he is. She paused. "Either your communication infrastructure has been compromised, or someone on your team sent it deliberately, or Marsh himself has a reach that extends into your operation's internal channels." She let the silence sit for 1 second. "Which is it?" The corridor around them continued its activity. A nurse passed with a medication cart. The ventilation system made its sounds. In the room behind her, Colonel Donovan Marsh was lying in a hospital bed with an IV in his arm and his respiratory function on the mend. Voss said, "Come with me." The room he took her to was the hospital's small administrative conference room, now vacated by his operations team and holding only the ghost of what it had been 3 hours ago. The table pushed slightly wrong, an empty coffee cup someone had forgotten, the wall where the map had been taped showing faint adhesive marks. He closed the door. Marsh reached out to 3 separate parties in the 40 minutes before his convoy was hit, Voss said. He said it without preamble, which she appreciated. "We know this because we have the communication logs." He contacted a financial investigator in his own chain, which was expected. He contacted a journalist with a national security beat, which was not protocol, but which we understood as insurance. He stopped, and he contacted a private data brokerage firm that has documented connections to 2 defense contractors, one of which is a subsidiary of Armistice Solutions. She processed this. "He was working both sides," she said. "We don't know that definitively. It's possible he was running a counter-infiltration operation that he hadn't disclosed to his chain of command. It's possible the third contact was a trap he was setting. It's also possible—" Voss paused with the weight of a man saying something he'd rather not. "It's possible that the evidence on the drive is real and complete and exactly what he says it is, and that Marsh himself has also been managing a secondary arrangement that doesn't negate the primary one. People can be compromised in layers," she said. "Yes." "The 18 names on the drive. Are they the people he was protecting or the people he was burning?" "That's what we're currently determining." He looked at her steadily. "The analyst working the drive content is one of 4 people in this operation who doesn't have any connection to Marsh's chain of command. She's been on it for 3 hours. We'll have a preliminary read by noon. And in the meantime, Marsh is in this building. In the meantime, Marsh is in this building, and Corvin is in federal custody, and Briggs is in federal custody, and everything proceeds on the current operational timeline until we know whether to adjust it." She thought about the message on the device. "Who sent it?" "Ferris," Voss said. He said it with the flatness of someone who'd already established this and wasn't surprised by it. "He found a way to access the communication channel from the vehicle. He's been in Armistice's internal infrastructure for 8 months. Finding communication channels is apparently a habit." He paused. "He's been trying to tell us something about Marsh for 3 weeks. We've been treating it as a potential disinformation play, because Ferris is not a clean source, and his motivation to muddy the primary evidence is not zero. But the third communication log," Voss said, "is real, and it doesn't go away." Claire stood with this for a moment. The honest shape of it was uncomfortable. She had treated Marsh. She had made decisions based on the assumption that he was what she'd been told he was. She had gone into that facility and through that service corridor and dropped through that access panel because the operation had a logic that she'd accepted and moved through. That logic was still intact. The people she'd helped recover were real. The charges in that building had been real. The VX-7 in Marsh's bloodstream had been real. But the interpretation layer, the story that sat on top of those facts, was less certain than it had appeared 6 hours ago. "What do you need from me?" she said. "Right now, keep treating him. Don't change anything in your interaction with him that would signal the assessment has shifted." He held her gaze. "And if he tells you anything further, any information he offers without prompting, document it exactly. You want me to keep monitoring him. I want you to keep doing your job," he said, "which you've been doing better than anyone in this building for the last 12 hours. The monitoring is incidental." She looked at him. "That's not nothing," he said, with the specific directness of a man who didn't say things like that often and meant them precisely when he did. She went back to Marsh's room. He was sleeping when she entered, or appeared to be, the particular stillness of someone who had either genuinely lost consciousness or had excellent control over their presentation. She checked the monitor, updated the OBS log, adjusted one variable in the protocol without speaking, and was 3 minutes into a secondary respiratory assessment when he said, without opening his eyes, "You talk to Voss." "I talk to Voss regularly," she said. "He's running the operation." "He told you about the third communication." She paused for half a second before she continued the assessment. Why would you think that? Because you came back with different hands, he said. He opened his eyes. Medics do that. The assessment starts at the same place, but the pressure changes. When you're evaluating someone you're not certain about, you press differently. He looked at the ceiling. It was the contact with the data brokerage. She set down the stethoscope. It looks bad, he said. I know how it looks. I need you to know that I understand exactly how it looks because I made a deliberate decision and I was aware of what it would appear to be if it was ever examined out of context. He turned his head to look at her. I was trying to identify a second leak. Not Corvin. We had Corvin tracked for months. There was someone else. Someone who was feeding real-time operational information to Armistice between the time operations were planned and the time they launched. Corvin had the access but not the specific technical knowledge. Someone else was running the actual data feeds. And you thought the data brokerage was connected to them. I knew it was. I found the payment chain 6 weeks before the convoy hit. I made contact to trace the downstream, to find out who the brokerage was actually working for. He exhaled carefully. I didn't disclose it to my chain of command because my chain of command included Nathan Corvin, and anything I disclosed was going to Armistice within 48 hours. Is that documented? On the drive, he said. Section 7 of the financial annex, the contact log, the reason for it, and the subsequent trace which identified a name. He paused. A name that is not on the 18 Voss has already seen. She looked at him. His name is Garrett Pollard, Marsh said. He's a data systems contractor embedded in the Eastern Defense Operations Logistics Division. He's been running the real-time feed for 14 months, and he stopped. He is still active because nobody has moved on him, because until the drive was recovered this morning, the only people who knew about him were me and a data brokerage I can no longer vouch for. He held her gaze. If Pollard knows the drive has been recovered, he knows his name is in Section 7. And if he knows that, he has a window of approximately, he checked the clock, 4 to 6 hours before the drive analysis reaches Section 7. She was already at the door. Claire, his voice stopped her. You don't owe me anything, I know that. But the people whose names are on that drive, the 18, they're real, and the cases against them are solid, and if Pollard gets out before the analysis reaches Section 7, he pulls threads that unravel pieces of it. He paused. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to trust the math. She left the room. But Voss was back on his radio when she found him, and she walked past the first 2 sentences of his conversation and waited for a break and then said, Garrett Pollard, Data Systems Contractor, Eastern Defense Operations Logistics Division, and watched his face. The reaction was small and controlled and told her everything. He ended the radio call. Section 7, she said. I'm aware of Section 7, he said. My analyst flagged it 14 minutes ago. Then why? Because Pollard's access was revoked 6 hours ago when we moved on Corvin, he said. He can't pull feeds he no longer has credentials for. He paused. What he can do is destroy the records of what he already pulled. His personal archive of operational data, the communications he intercepted, the identity packages on every asset whose cover he burned over the last 14 months. Another pause. We've had a warrant application running for 90 minutes. It was just approved. My people are at his residence now. She absorbed this. You already knew, she said. The drive analysis is moving quickly. Marsh, he stopped, chose his words. Marsh is complicated. What he did with the data brokerage contact was a significant procedural breach, and it's going to require a full review. But his intelligence on Pollard is accurate, and the documentation is solid, and the case as a whole is, he looked at her. It holds. The whole thing holds. Is he compromised or isn't he? He made an unauthorized contact that introduced risk into the operation because he didn't trust his chain of command, and his distrust of his chain of command was completely justified given that his chain of command included Nathan Corvin. He met her eyes. He's not clean. He's also not the enemy. Those two things can coexist, and they do, regularly, in this kind of work. She thought about 6 years of doing a job correctly in an institution that had its own corruption running quietly underneath the professional surface. She thought about the things she'd let slide because the cost of fighting them was too high, and the one thing she hadn't let slide, and what that night had cost and what it had produced. She thought about Pryor moving toward Briggs in that north section, with no training and no weapon and no calculation, just a man who had, at the last possible moment, made the only decision available to him that wasn't entirely wrong. People could be complicated. She knew that. She'd always known that. The knowing of it wasn't the problem. The problem was learning to act correctly in the middle of the complication, without the clarity that only came afterward. "All right," she said. "Tell me about the offer." Pollard was taken into custody at 7:43 a.m. at an apartment 2 miles from the Eastern Defense Operations Building. He had, by the time the warrant team arrived, already destroyed a significant portion of his personal archive. Not all of it. The deletion was incomplete, the kind that suggested he'd been interrupted mid-process either by the arrival of the team or by the simple human fact that destroying evidence under pressure was harder than people expected it to be. The recovered fragments were fragmentary but sufficient. That was the word the analyst used when she briefed Voss at 8:30, sufficient. Sufficient to prosecute. Sufficient to close the loop. Sufficient to give the drive's contents the corroborating foundation they needed to hold under the legal scrutiny that was going to come. It came fast. By 9 a.m., the story had broken. Not through any channel Voss's operation had authorized. The journalist Marsh had contacted before the convoy hit had been sitting on the financial documents Marsh sent him for 4 days, waiting for a verification he'd been trying to independently source. And the Harwick operation and Corvin's arrest gave him the verification through a back channel he declined to name. The story ran at 8:57 a.m. with a headline that named Armistice Solutions, named Corvin, named 3 of the procurement officials from the drive, and described in general terms the existence of a classified nerve agent program that had been running outside sanctioned parameters for 5 years. By 9:30, it was national. By 10, the Hargrove Peak parking lot had 3 news vehicles in it. Claire watched them arrive from the window of the break room, where she was on her 3rd cup of bad coffee and her body was finally presenting its full invoice for 26 hours without sleep. She watched the journalists set up their equipment with the organized urgency of people who had a story that was still breaking and weren't sure how much of it they had. She thought about how stories got told, how the version that made the news was always a simplified architecture of what had actually happened. The facts that were legible from the outside, the names that were already public, the decisions that fit into a narrative shape that people could absorb. The version that didn't make the news was everything else. The 4 seconds of lucidity in the ER, the enzyme pattern in a metabolic panel at midnight, the service corridor in the dark, Marcus's face when they walked her out, and the fact that he had written everything down at 3 a.m. anyway, the things that happened in the margins, between the events that got reported. Those were the things that had actually mattered. Voss appeared in the doorway at 10:15. "The hospital administration wants to make a statement," he said. "Their legal team has been in contact with our press liaison. They're going to address the situation with Dr. Pryor." He paused. "They've asked whether you would be present for it." "Why would they want me there?" "Because Pryor's arrest is going to be part of the statement, and his actions toward you are part of the evidentiary record of what he was doing and why. And because—" He stopped, started again. "Because their legal team told them it would be in their best interest to be seen treating you correctly, and their administration heard that and somehow arrived at the conclusion that asking you to stand in a room while they read a statement counts as treating you correctly." She almost laughed. "They want me to legitimize their press strategy," she said. "Yes." "What do you think I should do?" "I think," Voss said carefully, "that you don't owe them your presence. I also think that there are people in this hospital, staff, nurses, people who watched what happened last night and have been watching what Pryor did for years, for whom seeing the record corrected publicly would mean something." She thought about Marcus at 3 a.m., writing it all down. She thought about this woman who had waited 4 hours with a cut that needed 7 stitches and kept apologizing for taking up space. She thought about all the small, quiet ways that institutions protected themselves instead of the people inside them, and how the people inside them learned to adapt to that and what it cost over time. "Tell them I'll be there," she said, "but I'm not standing in the background. If I'm in that room, I'm in it." The statement happened at 11 a.m. in the hospital's main lobby, in front of the reception desk, with the 3 news vehicles' cameras arranged outside the glass and the hospital's interim administrator, a precise, careful woman named Director Halverson, who had apparently been in her role for 4 days before this particular Tuesday arrived, reading from a prepared text that her legal team had clearly written and that she was clearly going to follow exactly. Claire stood to Halverson's left. Voss stood 2 steps back. The lobby had hospital staff in it, not staged, not assembled, but the genuine accumulation of people who were between shifts or had lingered or had found a reason to be in the main corridor at 11 a.m. Marcus was there. Reyes was there. Torres from security was there near the back, with his arms crossed and the expression of someone who had been in this building a long time and had been waiting for this particular morning for most of it. Halverson read the statement. It covered the termination. A decision made under circumstances that have since been revealed to involve significant conflicts of interest on the part of the terminating physician. It covered the clinical record. A review of the patient's presentation and the treatment administered has determined that the actions taken by Ms. Hartwell were medically appropriate and potentially life-saving. It covered the evidentiary findings. Dr. Wallace Pryor has been remanded to federal custody pending charges that include conspiracy, obstruction, and violations of the federal anti-corruption statutes. And then it said, in language that the legal team had written and that Halverson read with a steadiness that suggested she believed it. Hargrove Peak Medical Center formally and unreservedly acknowledges that Ms. Claire Hartwell was wrongfully terminated. The termination is expunged from her employment record with immediate effect. The hospital owes Ms. Hartwell a direct and unqualified apology, and we offer it now without condition. Halverson looked up from the paper. She looked at Claire. I'm sorry, she said. It was off script. Her voice had a different quality than the statement. Smaller, more direct, less managed. That's from me, not the lawyers. I'm sorry. Claire looked at her. Thank you, she said. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't absolution, it wasn't the resolution of 6 years in a sentence. It was just what it was. 2 people in a lobby, one of them saying the thing that was true, and the other one receiving it, and the small, imperfect dignity of that exchange. Outside, the cameras recorded it. Pryor was arraigned at 2 p.m. She didn't watch it happen. She was in the room with Marsh when the feed played on the small TV mounted in the corner, and she watched his face as much as she watched the screen. He watched Pryor stand at the arraignment table with the particular diminishment of a man whose constructed self had been fully disassembled, and he said nothing, and she watched him say nothing, and understood that his silence was its own thing. Pryor pled not guilty. His attorney was expensive and composed and said the expected things. The federal prosecutor was younger than Claire had expected and said less than she'd expected, which was usually the sign of someone who had more than they needed and knew it. The charges were extensive. Conspiracy to obstruct intelligence operations, receipt of payments from a sanctioned defense contractor in violation of federal conflict of interest statutes, facilitating the transfer of a protected federal officer to armed non-state actors. The list continued for 2 minutes at a reading pace, and Marsh, watching it, made a sound that wasn't quite anything she had a name for. He thought he was protected, Marsh said. That's the thing. He wasn't doing it because he was afraid. He was doing it because he thought the people he was working with were more permanent than the institutions that were supposed to be checking them. A lot of people think that, she said. Most of them are wrong. Not always, she said, because that was honest. Not often enough. He looked at her. Is that why you left? She was quiet for a moment. I left because I made a decision in a situation where I shouldn't have had to make it alone, she said. And the decision was right, and the outcome was right, and I still came home with something I couldn't put down. She paused. I left because I needed to find out if I could exist without it, without being ghost, without every situation being a situation. Could you? She thought about 6 years of answering to Sparrow. 6 years of a hospital that both needed her and didn't acknowledge what she was. 6 years of being right about things that mattered and letting the institutional framework use that and deny it simultaneously. I existed, she said. That's not quite the same thing. He looked at the TV where Pryor was being led from the room. And now? She didn't answer immediately. Well, The offer Voss made was not the offer she'd expected. She'd expected something operational, a return to the specific work she'd left, the field work and the extractions, and the casualty management and conditions that the people responsible for them tried hard to make legible and mostly couldn't. She'd expected to be asked to step back into the shape she'd been. What Voss offered was different. He sat across from her in the administrative conference room at 3 p.m., with Loon present and a tablet with a program overview that he turned to face her and left there without making her read it under pressure. The VX7 program is one of 4 active unauthorized research pipelines that the drive has now given us confirmed evidence of, he said. The others involve 2 biological vectors and a delivery system modification program that's been running in parallel to a legitimate research contract for 3 years. He let that land. The people who built these programs are not field operators. They're not Briggses. They're researchers and administrators and physicians who work inside institutions that are supposed to have oversight mechanisms in place. And those oversight mechanisms have been compromised or co-opted, or simply were never adequate for what these programs were doing. You need someone who can read the medical components, she said. I need someone who can read the medical components and who also understands the operational context, and who has the specific capability to function in both environments when the situation requires it. He paused. This is not a field position. It's a program advisory role with field response capability. It involves reviewing research documentation, assessing exposure protocols, working with investigation teams on the medical dimensions of evidence analysis, and deploying for casualty management when a situation develops that requires the specific combination. The specific combination being? Someone who can walk into an ER at midnight and correctly identify a classified nerve agent from enzyme patterns, he said, and then drop through an access panel in a building full of explosives 4 hours later. She looked at the tablet. Who else knows this program exists? She said. It's currently a proposal pending approval by a joint oversight board, he said. The approval is contingent on finding the right person to lead it. He paused. There have been 3 candidates. All 3 reviewed the scope and concluded it required a skill set they didn't have. So they were honest about their limitations. Yes, that's more than most people would be. She looked at the program overview. It was 22 pages, and she'd read enough of it in the previous hour to understand the shape of it, the medical intelligence gap it was trying to address, the cases in the last 5 years where the gap had produced outcomes that were worse than they'd needed to be. I want to see the full oversight structure before I decide anything. Who the board is, what the reporting chain looks like, what the parameters are for independent action. That's reasonable. And I want Reyes. Voss blinked. Dr. Reyes. He's good, and he's not institutional about it. If this program involves field medical response in any configuration, I need a physician who can adapt rather than one who needs the situation to match his training. She held Voss's gaze. Those people are not common. He's one of them. Voss looked at Lund briefly, then back to her. I'll ask him, she said. He doesn't know me well enough to know whether to trust your judgment. He knows me well enough to know whether to trust mine. A pause. All right, Voss said. Bishem. She found Reyes in the corridor at 4 p.m., coming off the shift extension he'd taken because the situation had required it, and because she was beginning to understand that was how he operated. She told him what the role was in the same direct terms Voss had used with her. He listened without interrupting, which she'd expected. He asked 2 questions. About the reporting structure and about the protocols for medical independence when an operational commander's tactical judgment conflicted with medical necessity. Both were exactly the right questions. I'm not saying yes tonight, he said. I need to read the oversight documentation. I'll send it to you. Do you think it's the right thing to do? He said it plainly, not as a way of asking her to make the decision for him, but as a genuine inquiry into her assessment, which was its own kind of respect. She thought about what Marsh had said, a corner of it. The network was larger than tonight. The gap that had allowed tonight was real, and closing it through the slow mechanisms of institutional reform was the correct approach if you had years to spare and an oversight apparatus that wasn't already compromised at multiple levels. I think it's necessary, she said. I think we'll do it imperfectly, and we'll make calls that we'll have to defend afterward, and some of them will be wrong. I think the alternative is worse. He nodded slowly. I'll read it tonight. She went back to Marcia's room for what she told herself was the final clinical assessment before transport, and she did the assessment thoroughly and adjusted one last protocol variable and wrote the final handoff notes with the specific completeness that meant whoever received him at the next level of care would have everything they needed and nothing they didn't. He watched her work. You're taking the role, he said. I'm considering it. You're taking it, he said. You have the same look you had in the ER before you gave me the atropine. She capped the pen. What look is that? Like you've already decided and you're finishing the paperwork, he said. She put the chart down. Get better, she said, and then answer every question the oversight board asks you honestly, including the uncomfortable ones. He held her gaze. I will. The third communication. The data brokerage contact. Don't let the legitimate parts of what you did become a reason to obscure the parts that were a breach. A pause. I know, he said. You're right. I know I'm right. She picked up her jacket from the chair. That's never been the issue. She was at the door when he said her name. Not Ghost. Claire. Thank you, he said. For the real thing, not the operational version, the actual thing. She looked at him for a moment. A man who was complicated and had done a thing that mattered and had also done things that needed accounting for. Lying in a bed that he was going to walk out of because she'd been paying attention at midnight when the institutional authority told her not to. Take care of yourself, she said. She walked out. The drive's full analysis was complete by 6 p.m. 23 individuals, final count. 3 government procurement officials. 7 armistice executives and board members. 4 researchers embedded in legitimate defense contractors. Corvin and Pollard. Pryor. And 8 others whose identities the analysis team had spent the day excavating from the financial routing chains with the methodical patience of people who knew the work was slow and that slow was correct. All 23 were either in custody or had federal holds issued by 6 p.m. The arrests happened across 4 states simultaneously, coordinated through a channel that excluded Corvin's former division entirely, and that Voss had been building quietly for 7 weeks in parallel with the visible operation, precisely because he'd known that the visible operation had a leak and the parallel one needed to be clean. Claire heard about it from Lund, who delivered the information with the same flat precision she used for everything and who allowed herself, at the end of the delivery, a single small exhale that communicated more than an hour of articulation could have. 23, Claire said. 23, Lund confirmed. She sat with that number for a moment. It was an incomplete number. The network was larger and the investigation was ongoing, and there were threads that would take months or years to pull to their ends. She knew that. The work was not done. But 23 people who had believed themselves protected by the permanence of their arrangements were now finding out that the arrangements had ended, and the finding out was happening publicly, in handcuffs, with documentation that would be presented in courtrooms. And the documentation had been on a drive that a man in a hospital bed had protected with 4 days of silence in a room where they weren't gentle about asking. That was not nothing. It was not everything. But it was not nothing. She left the hospital at 7 p.m. The parking lot was clearer than it had been. The news vehicles had reduced to 1. The military assets had been redeployed or stood down. The overnight normality of a hospital approaching evening was reasserting itself in the way that the rhythms of necessary places always did, pushing back against whatever had disrupted them, finding the shape of function again. Marcus was at his car when she crossed the lot. He'd clearly just ended his shift. Still in scrubs, bag over one shoulder, moving with the specific heaviness of someone who had been awake for too long and was finally pointing toward the end of it. He saw her and stopped. "Are you coming back?" he said. She thought about the 22 pages on the tablet, about the oversight structure she needed to review, about Reyes and the 2 right questions he'd asked, about the gap that needed someone to stand in it, and the specific combination of capabilities that standing in it required. "Not here," she said. He nodded. "Good," he said, and she heard everything in that word. Not dismissal, not relief, but the specific recognition of a person who understood that some people were too large for the containers that had been holding them, and that the containers weren't the problem and weren't to blame. They were just the wrong size. "Document everything," she said, "for as long as it matters. Make sure the record is accurate." "I will." He paused. "Claire, you knew who you were the whole time, even when you were letting him call you Sparrow. You never forgot." She looked at him. "I forgot some days," she said. "Enough to keep going some days." He smiled, the tired, honest smile of someone who understood that answer completely. She kept walking. The evening air was cold and clean in the way that air was after sustained rain, stripped of its accumulated particulate, honest about itself. She stood beside her car and looked at the hospital building. The lights were on across multiple floors. People were inside working, the endless necessary work of a place that absorbed the broken and tried to return them intact. The work that had no completion and no final resolution and kept starting over every time a new shift began. She had been part of that for 6 years. She had done it well, even in the years when doing it well meant doing it under the wrong name, answering to a designation that diminished her, proving her competence in the margins of a system that used her without acknowledging her. She had not forgotten who she was, but she had also not been fully herself. There was a difference, she understood now, between surviving and inhabiting, between keeping yourself intact through an experience and actually being present in it. She had survived the last 6 years. She had been careful and thorough and correct, and she had survived. She thought it might be time to try the other thing. Her phone buzzed. Voss's message. "Oversight documentation sent, no timeline, when you're ready." She looked at the message. She thought about what it meant to be seen clearly, not idealized, not diminished, not simplified into a version that was easier to manage or easier to dismiss. Just seen. For what you actually were, in the full, complicated, contradictory human weight of it. She had been invisible for 6 years, not because she'd been hiding, but because the people around her had chosen not to look. And the thing she was learning, slowly, was that other people's failure to look was not the same as not being there. She had always been there. She had been there at midnight with an atropine syringe and a red on an enzyme panel that nobody else in that building would have caught. And she had been there in a service corridor 4 feet wide with her knees on deteriorating metal and a medical kit on her back. And she had been there in the moment when everything was going to go one way or the other. And she had been the thing that made it go the right way. Not because she was perfect. Not because she was fearless. Not because the decisions were clean or the outcomes were certain. Because she had refused, at the critical moment, to pretend she was less than she was. That was the thing. That was the whole thing. The women who got dismissed, the people who got called Sparrow, the nurses who got walked out of buildings in the rain while the people who should have been protecting them looked away. The institution's failure to see them was real, and it cost them real things, and it was wrong. All of that was true. And also, it did not determine the ending. They determined the ending when they refused to become what the dismissal said they were, when they kept doing the work correctly even when the work went unacknowledged, when they didn't let the smallness of what they were given shrink what they actually were. It was not an easy truth. It required more than it should have from people who were already carrying more than they should have to. That was the honest accounting of it, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But it was still true. She got in her car. She sat for a moment in the quiet of it, with the hospital lights visible through the windshield and the evening dark around her, and everything that had happened in the last 20 hours settling into the specific weight of experience that didn't resolve immediately, but would, over time, become something she understood. She started the engine. She had documents to read. She had a conversation with Reyes tomorrow morning. She had a decision that was more than one decision, that was actually a direction, and the direction was forward, and it was clear, and it was hers. For the first time in 6 years, the call sign didn't feel like a thing she'd left behind. It felt like a thing she'd been carrying carefully, all the way to the moment when she needed it. She had always been Ghost. She had just been waiting for the world to be ready to deserve her again. She pulled out of the parking lot and drove into the dark, and she did not look back.